Imagine standing in the most magnificent ballroom in England, draped in silk, your heart full of a future you believed was yours, only to watch the man you loved announce his engagement to someone else, in front of everyone, without warning, without mercy. That was the night Lady Eliza Whitmore died inside, but it was also the night she was reborn. What happened next shocked all of England, and no one saw it coming. Stay until the very end. You won't regret it. Like, subscribe, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to know where in the world you're watching from. London, December 1848. The candles in Ashford Hall burned like 1,000 fallen stars. There were nights in London that existed purely for spectacle, evenings constructed not for warmth or joy, but for the performance of power, the display of wealth, and the silent, ruthless sport of social ranking. The winter assembly at Ashford Hall was precisely such a night. The chandeliers dripped with crystal. The champagne flowed in rivers of pale gold. Ladies in silk gowns orbited the room like planets around competing suns, and the men who escorted them wore their titles the way soldiers wore medals, not out of sentiment, but out of strategy. Lady Eliza Whitmore moved through it all with the quiet certainty of someone who believed, perhaps for the last time in her life, that she understood the rules of the world she inhabited. She was 24 years old, the daughter of Lord Edmund Whitmore, Baron of Ashgate, a man of modest but respectable fortune, whose family name carried 3 centuries of honorable service and whose estate in the northern hills had never once embarrassed him. Eliza had grown up on that estate, riding through frost-hardened meadows at dawn, reading by oil lamp long after the household had gone to sleep, and learning, as all daughters of the English gentry were expected to learn, how to present herself, how to speak, how to enter a room as though she belonged there completely. She had mastered it all, but she had never learned to be cold. That, it turned out, would cost her everything. She stood near the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, wearing a gown of deep midnight blue that her mother had selected with military precision. The color was intentional. Midnight blue said serious, elegant, trustworthy. It said, "I am not a girl playing at society. I am a woman who has arrived." Beside her, or rather, conspicuously absent from beside her, was Adrian Caldwell, the Duke of Norley. Eliza scanned the room again without turning her head, a skill she had honed over years of ballrooms exactly like this one. Adrian was easy to find. He always was. There was a gravitational quality to him, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair swept back from a face that seemed to have been carved specifically to make women forget their better judgment. He moved through a crowd the way a ship moved through water, effortlessly, powerfully, leaving a wake behind him. He was standing near the fireplace, which blazed with enough wood to heat a small village. Around him stood a cluster of men in expensive coats, and one woman Eliza did not immediately recognize, though she noted with the trained eye of someone who had attended 4 London seasons that the woman's jewelry was extraordinary. A pearl and diamond necklace that probably cost more than her father's annual income from his estates. A gown of ivory satin that had clearly been made in Paris, not London. The cut was different. The fabric caught the light differently. Even the way the woman stood was different. Not the careful, practiced elegance of an English lady trained since childhood, but something looser, more confident, as though the world itself had never told her she was taking up too much space. American, Eliza thought instinctively. She didn't know, in that moment, that she was looking at the woman who would destroy her life. Her name was Miss Catherine Bellows, and she had arrived in London 6 weeks earlier aboard a private steamer, accompanied by her father, a Massachusetts industrialist who had made an incomprehensible fortune in railroads and was now engaged in the equally serious business of buying his daughter a title. It was not an uncommon arrangement. The late 1840s had produced no shortage of English noblemen with magnificent bloodlines and catastrophically mismanaged estates. The arrangement was mutually understood, if never openly discussed. American money would rescue English dignity, and English dignity would give American money something it could never manufacture on its own: antiquity, rank, and the quiet, devastating authority of old prestige. Adrian Caldwell was, by any measure, the most attractive candidate in England for such an arrangement. His estates were in trouble. Norley Park, the ancestral Caldwell seat in Wiltshire, had been bleeding money for a decade, the result of his late father's spectacular incompetence with investment, a series of agricultural failures during the blight years, and Adrian's own quietly acknowledged fondness for the kinds of private entertainments that did not appear on any official ledger. He needed a fortune. He needed it badly. He had simply been hoping for 2 years that the solution would present itself in a form he could live with. Miss Catherine Bellows, with her £40,000 a year and her father's railroad empire, was that solution presented in ivory satin. Eliza would not learn any of this that night. Not the full picture, not the debts, not the negotiations that had apparently already begun in private, not the fact that Adrian had met Catherine Bellows at a dinner party 3 weeks ago and had, according to those who were present, spent the entire evening attending to no one else. What she knew, standing at that window with her untouched champagne, was that Adrian had promised to meet her at 8 o'clock, that it was now 9:30, and that he had not once crossed the room to find her. She told herself there was an explanation. She was very good at finding explanations. It was one of the things about herself that she would later recognize as both her greatest strength and, in this particular instance, her most catastrophic flaw. "You've been standing in that spot for 40 minutes, said a voice behind her. Eliza turned. It was her cousin, Margaret Whitmore, 2 years older, sharper-tongued, and possessed of a social radar that Eliza had always privately envied. Margaret had married well at 21, a kind, prosperous landowner from Surrey who bored her mildly but never caused her distress. She called this arrangement satisfactory, which Eliza had always thought sounded like the saddest word in the English language. "I'm simply enjoying the view," Eliza said. "The view," Margaret said carefully, "appears to be watching Adrian Caldwell speak to a very beautiful American woman for the better part of an hour. He'll come find me." Eliza, "He will, Margaret." Margaret looked at her with an expression that was not pity. Margaret was too precise for pity, but something adjacent to it. Concern edged with the uncomfortable knowledge of someone who can see the end of the story before it happens. "Her father owns 4 railroad lines," Margaret said quietly. "He arrived in London with letters of introduction to half the peerage. I've heard his fortune mentioned in the same sentence as the word immense more times in the past month than I care to count." Eliza's hand tightened slightly around her champagne glass. "Adrian's engagement to me is understood by everyone in this room." "It's understood," Margaret said, "but it is not formalized. There has been no announcement, no contract, no formal offer to your father." She paused. "I say this as someone who loves you, Eliza, not to be cruel." "I know," Eliza said, and she did know. That was the thing. She knew Margaret was right in every technical detail. The engagement was real to her, real to Adrian, real in every morning ride they had shared on Rotten Row, real in every letter he had written her over the summer, real in every private conversation and every lingering look that 100 witnesses had observed and interpreted correctly. But it was real the way a promise is real, entirely dependent on the character of the person who made it. She hadn't fully understood that yet. An hour later, the character of that person became undeniable. The music had stopped, deliberately, she would realize later, which meant someone had planned this, had arranged the timing, had spoken to the orchestra. And Lord Henry Ashford, their host, stepped to the center of the room with the practiced authority of a man who enjoyed announcing things. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lord Ashford said, and the room oriented itself toward him with the practiced instinct of 400 people trained since birth to pay attention when someone with authority cleared his throat. "I have the distinct pleasure this evening of sharing a joyful announcement." Eliza looked across the room. She found Adrian immediately. She always found him immediately. And what she saw in the half-second before she understood what was happening would stay with her for years. She saw him standing straight, composed, certain. He was not looking at her. "His Grace Adrian Caldwell, Duke of Norley," Lord Ashford continued, "has announced his engagement to Miss Catherine Bellows of Boston, Massachusetts, daughter of Mr. Charles Bellows. We wish them every happiness." The room erupted, not in gasps, not exactly. 400 people trained in the performance of decorum do not gasp. But there was a collective shift, a reorganization of attention that moved through the ballroom like a current through water, and at the center of that current, at the still, cold eye of it, was Eliza Whitmore. She didn't move. She would think about that afterward, how she didn't move, didn't drop her glass, didn't make a sound, didn't give them the satisfaction of a visible wound. She stood absolutely still, as if her body had made the decision before her mind did. You will not fall apart in this room. Across the ballroom, Adrian finally looked at her. She had expected, in some animal part of herself, to find shame there, or regret, at least. Something that acknowledged the reality of what he had just done. Something that said, I know what this costs you. I know what I am. What she found instead was something far more devastating. Relief. He looked relieved, as though a difficult matter had been resolved, a problem solved, a debt paid. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to register that she had seen him, long enough to constitute a kind of acknowledgement. And then he looked away, back toward Catherine Bellows and her extraordinary pearl necklace and her 40,000 pounds a year, and he smiled. Margaret appeared at Eliza's elbow. We're leaving, she said. Her voice had gone flat and decisive in the way it did when she had made up her mind about something completely. No, Eliza said. Eliza. No. Her voice was very quiet, very controlled. I'm not leaving. I won't give them that. She turned back to the window. Outside, London lay under a cold December sky, the street lamps burning yellow against the dark, the carriages clattering over cobblestones below. The city looked exactly as it had looked an hour ago. It looked completely indifferent to what had just happened to her, which, she thought, was perhaps the most honest thing she had encountered all evening. She stood at that window for another hour. She spoke when spoken to. She smiled when the occasion required it. She held her champagne glass, still untouched, still refusing to shake, with a steadiness that cost her more than she would ever admit to anyone. And she watched as Adrian Caldwell laughed with his new fiancée across the room, as the woman with the pearl necklace placed her hand on his arm with the natural confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in any room, and as London society realigned itself, effortlessly and without apology, around the new arrangement of things. The carriage ride home was silent for a long time. Margaret sat across from her in the dark, the lamp swinging gently with the motion of the wheels. Outside, the city slid past the windows. Eliza watched it without seeing it. He could have told me privately, she said finally. He could have written. He could have come to see my father. There were 100 ways to end it that didn't involve... She stopped. Yes, Margaret said simply. He chose that way specifically. Eliza's voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was something that had changed shape, something that had cooled from grief into something harder and colder and more durable. He chose to do it in front of everyone, in front of me. Yes. Why? Margaret was quiet for a moment. Because it was easier, she said. He didn't have to face you. He made it a public announcement, which made it official and final before you could say a single word. And because, she hesitated, say it. Because men like Adrian Caldwell have never truly believed that the feelings of women like us constitute a significant problem. Eliza turned to look at her cousin. In the dim carriage light, Margaret's face was carefully neutral, but her eyes held something fierce and tired all at once. I'm not going to cry about this, Eliza said. I didn't imagine you would, and I'm not going to spend the next 6 months hiding in drawing rooms waiting for sympathy. Also not in your character. I'm going to... Eliza stopped, because she didn't know yet. That was the honest truth. She didn't know what she was going to do. She only knew what she wasn't going to do, and sometimes, she thought, that was the cleaner place to start. She was wrong about one thing. She had imagined she could return to normal London life, that she could simply endure the whispers, hold her head up, ride out the season with dignity, and let time do the work that time was supposed to do. She had underestimated the velocity of social cruelty when it is applied to a woman who has been publicly embarrassed by a powerful man. It began within days. Invitations stopped arriving, not all at once, but in a slow, unmistakable pattern, like candles being extinguished one by one. The morning calls grew shorter. Conversations developed a particular quality of surface brightness that had nothing warm underneath it, the way painted wood looks fine until you press on it and find the rot beneath. She heard the whispers the way you hear music from another room. Not the words, but the tone of them, the rhythm of pity and entertainment, and the faintly pleasurable cruelty that lives in the gap between other people's misfortune and your own safety. She heard through Margaret that some people said she had been too forward, had pressured Adrian into an understanding that he had never formally given. She heard that others said she had been naive, that any sensible woman would have known better than to rest her future on an unwritten promise from a duke with a failing estate. She heard, this one the sharpest, the one that cut lowest, that there were those who said perhaps she had always been a little too clever for her own good, a little too confident, a little too much herself, and that men of Adrian's position found in the end that they wanted someone more accommodating. She didn't cry about any of it, but she stopped sleeping well, and she knew that was the same thing, expressed by the body in its own private language. Her father found her in the library at 2 a.m, 3 weeks after the assembly. Lord Edmund Whitmore was a man of 60 who moved through the world with the quiet, unassuming certainty of someone who had long ago decided that dignity was the only currency worth accumulating. He had loved his wife fiercely until her death 7 years ago, had raised his daughter with the conviction that intelligence was not a liability in a woman, regardless of what society suggested, and had never, in Eliza's memory, told her to make herself smaller. He sat down across from her without speaking, which was his habit, and looked at the book she was holding, a volume on Northern agricultural reform, which she had not actually been reading, only using as a prop for her insomnia. "I've been thinking," Eliza said. "I know," her father said. "I want to go to Ashgate." He looked up. Ashgate was the family's country estate in Ravenshire, the northern property, the one that generated modest rents from tenant farmers and a view of considerable wild beauty and almost no social life whatsoever. It was, by the standards of London society, exile. "For how long?" he asked. "I don't know." "Eliza, I can't stay here." Her voice didn't waver, but she felt the weight of the words as she said them. "Not because I'm ashamed. I want you to know that. I'm not ashamed of anything I did, but I cannot stay in a city where my presence has become a form of entertainment for people who were never my friends, and where every morning begins with the question of whose pity I'll have to navigate today." Her father was quiet for a long moment. Outside the library window, London breathed and rattled in the dark. "There's a school," he said unexpectedly. Eliza blinked. "I'm sorry?" "In Ravenshire Village. There's been one, of a sort, for years. But it's poorly funded, poorly equipped. Mrs. Harwick, the postmaster's wife, has been teaching the children in her kitchen when the weather allows it. I had a letter from the estate manager last month saying the villagers had been asking whether something more permanent might be possible." He paused. "I told him I didn't know anyone who might be interested." Eliza looked at her father for a long moment. He was looking back at her with the careful neutrality he used when he was about to say something important, disguised as something casual. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "A father thinks," he said simply. She looked down at the book in her hands. Agricultural reform. Northern estates. A crumbling schoolhouse, and children learning arithmetic in a postmaster's wife's kitchen because no one with the means to do better had bothered to try. "When can the house be ready?" she asked. "By the end of January," he said. "If I write to the estate manager tomorrow." "Write tonight," Eliza said. She left London on a Tuesday morning in late January in a carriage packed with books, more books than dresses, a fact that had made her maid Agnes cast her eyes heavenward in an expression of devout suffering. The journey north took 2 full days. The landscape changed gradually at first, the manicured fields and managed hedgerows of the south giving way to something wilder and less apologetic. Great rolling moorland under a sky that seemed lower and more present than any sky she had ever seen in London, and hills that bore the marks of harder weather and older stone. She had expected to feel defeated. Instead, watching the wild country slide past the carriage window as the temperature dropped and the light turned the particular shade of clear, cold silver that only the north possessed, she felt something she hadn't expected at all. She felt like herself, not the version of herself that London had required, that careful, measured performance of appropriate elegance and strategic restraint. Not the woman who had stood at a window with untouched champagne and refused to fall apart in public. Not the woman who was the subject of whispers and the object of pity. Just herself. Eliza Whitmore, stubborn and bookish and furious and free. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the carriage window, and Ravenshire received her like a fact. See, Ashgate House was smaller than she remembered from childhood visits, or perhaps she had simply grown larger, in the interior way that mattered, and the house was accurately sized for the person she used to be. It sat at the edge of Ravenshire village proper, a stone manor of modest proportions with good bones and somewhat tired furnishings, and a garden that had gone spectacularly wild in the northern winter. Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper, a woman of 60 with the build of a ship's figurehead and the organizational precision of a military campaign, received her at the door with something that might have been warmth if you knew how to read it. "The fires are lit throughout," Mrs. Pratt informed her, "and dinner will be at 7. The east bedroom is aired and ready. The village has heard you've come, which means you'll have callers by Thursday whether you want them or not." "Tell me about the school," Eliza said. Mrs. Pratt blinked. Whatever question she had expected, it wasn't that. "The school," she said. "Yes, the children's school. My father told me—" "It's not much of a school," Mrs. Pratt said, with the bluntness of someone who had spent 40 years saying things plainly. "Mrs. Harwick does what she can, but her kitchen isn't built for 20 children. The old schoolhouse on Becker Lane has been empty 3 years. The roof leaked through 2 winters and the floorboards went soft. No one's had the money or the will to fix it." "I'd like to see it," Eliza said. "Tomorrow morning." Mrs. Pratt looked at her with an expression that was recalibrating. "Very well," she said. Eliza carried her own books up to the east bedroom that evening, arranged them on the windowsill with the methodical pleasure of someone organizing a plan rather than a library, and stood for a long time looking out at the dark northern hills. London felt very far away. Adrian Caldwell's face, that 3-second look across a ballroom, that devastating relief, felt like something that had happened to a different woman in a different life. She was still angry. She expected she would be angry for a long time, but underneath the anger, or perhaps woven through it, was something new, something pointed and purposeful in hers. Build something, she thought. Build something real. The schoolhouse on Becker Lane was worse than Mrs. Pratt had described. Eliza stood in the doorway the next morning, her breath misting in the cold air, and surveyed the damage with the honest eye of someone who had no one to perform optimism for. The roof had given way in 3 sections. The floorboards were rotted through in great irregular patches, so that crossing the room required navigating between sections of solid wood like stepping stones over a dark, damp abyss. The windows had lost most of their glass to some long-ago storm. A family of starlings had made extensive renovations to the rafters and clearly considered the structure theirs. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "it'll fall down on its own within the year," said a voice behind her. She turned. A woman of about 40 stood on the lane, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, carrying a basket over one arm. She had the weathered, matter-of-fact face of someone accustomed to northern winters and their associated damages. "You must be the lady from London," the woman said, without particular ceremony. "I'm Martha Harwick. My husband runs the post." "Lady Eliza Whitmore," Eliza said. "Yes, I've been told you've been teaching the children." "Teaching is a generous word for it. I've been keeping them in a room with books and hoping for the best." Mrs. Harwick studied the schoolhouse with an expression that mingled resignation and something stubborn and undefeated. "We've been asking for help with this building for 3 years. Nobody cares much about what happens to children in Ravenshire." "I do," Eliza said. Mrs. Harwick looked at her, a careful look, evaluating, not unfriendly but not immediately credulous either. "That's what people say," she said, "when they come north from London for a season and want to feel useful." "I'm not here for a season," Eliza said. Something shifted in Mrs. Harwick's expression. Not softening, exactly. More like the beginning of a revised hypothesis. No. I'm here because this is where I am now, and I'd like to help with the school if you'll allow it." Eliza looked back at the collapsing building, at the starlings investigating the rafters, at the rotted floor and the absent glass. Not manage it from a distance and feel virtuous about it. Actually help. Teach. Every day. Mrs. Harwick was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the hills and moved through the lane with cold purpose. "You've had an education," Mrs. Harwick said. Not a question. "Yes. The children here mostly haven't. Not proper. Their fathers work the farms and the mills, and they see education as something for other people's children." She paused. "You'd have to earn their trust, the families. They're not inclined toward London charity." "I understand. And the building's useless as it stands." "I can see that." Eliza studied the ruin for a moment. "What would it take to make it usable, or to find another space?" "Money," Mrs. Harwick said bluntly, "which is what we've always lacked." Eliza thought about the letter she had already sent to her father's estate manager, about the modest but sufficient household budget she had been given for Ashgate, about the conversation she intended to have as soon as she had assessed the situation, about how that budget might be redirected. "Let me see what I can do," she said. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the best of Eliza Whitmore's life up to that point. She moved through them with a focus that was, she recognized privately, partly genuine purpose, and partly the extremely useful anger of a woman who had been publicly humiliated and was determined to alchemize it into something that outlasted the hurt. She threw herself into the work of the school, or rather, the work of creating the school, with a ferocity that surprised the village and, if she was honest, surprised herself. She hired men to assess the schoolhouse and concluded, reluctantly, that repair was impractical. She redirected her household funds, wrote frank letters to her father detailing the situation, and secured enough money to rent the unused assembly room at the back of the Ravenshire public house, which was not ideal. It smelled faintly of ale and the floor was uneven, but it had 4 solid walls, a functioning fireplace, and windows that kept most of the weather out. She taught there 6 days a week, from 8:30 until 2 in the afternoon. The children came slowly, first in 2s and 3s, brought by cautious parents who had been persuaded by Mrs. Harwick that the London lady was real and persistent and not going away. They ranged in age from 5 to 14, wildly varied in what they knew and didn't know, possessed of the particular combination of shyness and shrewdness that belongs to children who have grown up watching adults carefully and trusting them selectively. She learned their names in the first week. She learned their particular enthusiasms and their particular silences in the second. By the 3rd week, she had a system. By the 4th, she had something that felt unmistakably like the beginning of a school. She was not naively romantic about it. The work was exhausting. Some mornings, the ale smell was overwhelming. Some children arrived hungry, which made learning mathematics more difficult than she had anticipated. Some parents pulled their children back at the first sign of spring planting season, because labor in a field was more immediately useful to a struggling family than literacy. She dealt with these problems one by one, with the unglamorous methodical persistence that, she was coming to believe, was the actual substance of meaningful work. Not inspiration or grand gestures, but the daily, unspectacular act of showing up and trying again. London felt like a story she had once read about someone else. Boom. She received one letter from Adrian. It arrived in mid-March, 6 weeks after she had come north. 3 paragraphs written in the elegant hand she had once found so effortlessly appealing. He expressed regret, but carefully. He said he hoped she understood the practical necessities of his situation. He suggested, in the oblique way of someone who has never had to say a difficult thing directly in his life, that he had always thought of her with the greatest esteem, that he hoped she would find in time that she put it in the fireplace without finishing it, watched the elegant handwriting turn to ash. Then she went back to preparing the following morning's arithmetic lesson, because 14 children were arriving at 8:30, and they deserved her full attention. Spring came to Ravenshire in early April, arriving not gently, as it did in London, but with the blunt directness of northern weather that has no patience for gradual transitions. The hills turned green almost overnight. The fields woke up. The light changed, opened up, became something vast and clear and indifferent and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with prettiness and everything to do with the scale of the land. Eliza walked to the assembly room every morning through that changing light, her skirts damp with dew from the fields, her mind already sorted into the day's lessons, and for the first time in months, she did not think about London before breakfast. She thought about the school. She thought about young Thomas Harwick, 9 years old and just beginning to read, who had spent 3 weeks pretending he couldn't understand letters because he thought his older brother would mock him for caring, and who had finally, last Tuesday, read an entire sentence aloud in the steady voice of someone who had just figured out how the world works. She thought about the assembly room, which had become genuinely inadequate, too small, too cold in the mornings, too loud when the pub opened in the evenings, and the walls did nothing to muffle the noise. She thought about the need for a real schoolhouse, a permanent one, a building that said, in the plain and honest language of stone and timber, "These children matter. They are not an afterthought." She wrote more letters. She knocked on doors. She spent 3 humbling afternoons making her case to men who heard her politely and then did nothing, because she was a woman from London and Ravenshire had its own gravity and she had not yet learned how to move within it. The spring wore on. The school held together by determination and Martha Harwick's practical genius and the growing, grudging respect of parents who had expected a charitable diversion and found instead a teacher who knew her subject and showed up every single day. It was not enough. She knew it wasn't enough. The building was wrong, the resources were stretched thin, and the children deserved permanence. What she needed was an ally. What she got, when the lightning finally came, was something she hadn't planned for at all. The storm arrived in late May without much warning, which was Ravenshire's style. The sky turned in the space of an hour from clear spring blue to a mass of purple-black cloud that moved over the hills with the speed and certainty of something that had always intended to arrive. The wind came first, that particular northern wind with personality in it, cold and deliberate, and then the thunder, rolling down from the high moors like a declaration. Eliza was at the assembly room when the storm broke. She sent the children home early, watching them scatter into the rain with the nimble expertise of children who had spent their whole lives in Ravenshire weather, and then she and Martha packed up the books and slates together while the rain hammered the roof and the thunder moved directly overhead, and the lightning was close enough that she could feel it in her back teeth. She was halfway home along Becker Lane when she smelled it. Smoke. She turned. The old schoolhouse at the far end of Becker Lane, the ruined one, the one that had been empty for 3 years, the one she had stood in the doorway of that first cold morning with her breath misting and her plans already forming, was on fire. Lightning, she realized. A direct strike on a roof already compromised, already half open to the sky, filled with 3 years of dry debris and a family of starlings who had built with extraordinary enthusiasm. The fire was very fast. She watched it, standing in the rain that was doing nothing useful because it was rain falling on a building that was already past saving, and she felt the blaze of heat even from 20 yards distance, and she watched the rotten walls and the ruined roof and the soft floors all go up together in the orange and yellow roar of something that had been waiting to fall for years and had simply been given permission. By the time the village men came running with their buckets, there was nothing to save. She stood in the rain and watched the schoolhouse burn, and she thought, something has to change now. She didn't know yet that the change would have a name, that the name would be Lucas Hawthorne, that the man known throughout Ravenshire as the Duke of Blackmore, reclusive, iron-willed, the keeper of the vast northern estate that lay beyond the hills at the edge of Ravenshire proper, had been watching the smoke from his study window, and had already decided to act. The morning after this fire, Ravenshire smelled of wet ash. It was the kind of smell that settled into everything, into clothing, into hair, into the walls of buildings that had been nowhere near the blaze. Eliza walked past the ruin on Becker Lane before breakfast because she needed to see it in daylight, and because she had always believed that refusing to look at a difficult thing clearly was the first step toward failing to solve it. What remained was not much. A partial wall at the north end, standing with the stubborn purposelessness of something that had survived, not because it was strong, but because it had been forgotten by the fire in its haste. The collapsed timber of the roof had fallen inward, creating a black heap at the center of what had been the floor, and steam rose from it in thin threads where the night's rain was still working through the debris. The starlings were gone. Even they had understood that this particular story was over. She stood in front of it for a long time. The loss was not, strictly speaking, hers. She had never taught in that building. She had looked at it from the doorway on her first morning in Ravenshire and assessed it for its potential and found it wanting. And yet the sight of it, reduced to this, to wet char and collapsed stone, and the memory of something that had never quite managed to become what it was supposed to be, sat in her chest with a weight she hadn't expected. Because it was not only the building she was looking at, she was looking at the limits of what she had been able to do. 4 months in Ravenshire, and the school she had built was still borrowed space in a room that smelled of ale, still dependent on the goodwill of a publican who had only agreed to the arrangement because Martha Harwick had known his mother. The children she taught had learned to read and cipher and recite and argue about the causes of the rain, but they did so in a room that could be reclaimed at a week's notice, in a structure that had no permanence, no declaration, nothing that said to the next generation, "This was built for you. This is yours." The burned ruin in front of her was a mirror. It showed her exactly how fragile everything she had constructed actually was. "It was the lightning strike on the west gable," said a voice behind her. She turned, expecting one of the village men who had come with buckets the night before. What she found instead was a stranger. He stood about 10 feet away wearing riding clothes that had clearly absorbed their share of the morning's mud, holding the reins of a large, dark horse with the absent ease of someone who had spent so much of his life on horseback that horses had become simply an extension of himself. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of face that northern weather produces in people who spend significant time outdoors. Not harsh exactly, but definite. A jaw that suggested he had formed opinions about the world and had not subsequently revised them without very good reason. Dark eyes under heavier brows. He was looking at the ruin with what appeared to be the same careful assessment she had been conducting herself, which was unexpected. "I beg your pardon," she said. "The lightning strike," he said, without turning to look at her. "It hit the west gable. You can see the scorch mark on the remaining wall there. The roof at that section was already open. The debris inside would have caught within seconds." He did look at her now. I watched the smoke from my study window. By the time I arrived, it was past saving. "You were here last night?" "On the road. I didn't think my presence at a fire I couldn't stop would be particularly useful." His voice was matter-of-fact rather than cold, though the line between the two was a fine one. "Lucas Hawthorne," he said. "Blackmore." Eliza looked at him for a moment. She had heard the name, of course. In a village the size of Ravenshire, the existence of a major estate and its owner was known the way weather was known, as a fundamental condition of life rather than a subject of casual conversation. She had heard it said that the Duke of Blackmore had returned to his estates 4 years ago after a long absence, that he managed them with an efficiency that the tenant farmers either respected or resented, depending on who was doing the talking, and that he did not participate in local society to any degree that could be measured. "Lady Eliza Whitmore," she said. "Ashgate." "I know who you are," he said. There was no particular inflection to this. It was not the knowing tone of someone conveying gossip, nor the careful neutrality of someone trying to pretend they hadn't heard the gossip. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered by a man who apparently dealt in facts rather than the social performance of them. "Then you'll also know," she said, turning back to the ruin, "that this building was the only space in Ravenshire that might have been repaired into a permanent schoolhouse, and that last night's fire has solved that possibility very definitively." "Yes," he said. "So if you've come to offer condolences—" "I haven't," he said. She waited. "I have an unused wing at Blackmore," he said. "The east wing. It's been closed for 6 years. Good structure, sound roof, 3 large rooms that served as a library and a music room and a schoolroom when the estate was fully staffed." He paused in the manner of someone proceeding through a logical argument they had already completed before opening their mouth. It would require cleaning and some repairs to the windows. A week's work, perhaps 2, after which it would accommodate 40 children more comfortably than this building ever would have. Eliza turned to look at him fully. "You're offering the use of your estate as a schoolhouse?" "Yes." "Why?" He seemed briefly to find this question slightly more complicated than the offer itself. Because the children in this village deserve a proper building, he said, and I have one that is doing nothing. The arithmetic is not difficult. The arithmetic, she said slowly, is not the question I'm asking. He looked at her. His dark eyes were direct, not aggressive, but without the quality of evasiveness she had become accustomed to reading in men of his rank, that practiced social deflection that kept real intentions safely obscured. He appeared to be genuinely considering her actual question, which was itself unusual enough to be worth noting. My estate has been closed in on itself for years, he said finally. That was my choice, and I made it for reasons that were sufficient at the time. They are less sufficient now. He looked back at the ruin. Ravenshire is not London. What happens here, what fails here, is visible in ways that London never permits. When something breaks in London, there are 20 convenient fictions to explain why it is not quite broken after all. He paused. There are no fictions in Ravenshire. There is only what is and what isn't. That building isn't. Those children need something that is. Eliza was quiet for a moment. She was aware, with some precision, of the social geography of what he was proposing. An unmarried woman of standing, accepting the use of a powerful nobleman's home as her base of operations was not, even in the wild northern hills, even in 1849, even in circumstances that would strike any reasonable observer as obviously practical, a thing without consequences. She was also aware with equal precision that she had already spent one entire season calculating consequences and trimming her actions to the shape of other people's comfort, and that it had bought her exactly nothing. I would need to see the space, she said. Tomorrow morning, he said, 8 o'clock. He mounted his horse without the additional ceremony that most men of his rank would have produced around a departure. No extended pleasantries, no performance of graciousness, simply a man who had said what he came to say and was now done with the saying of it. He turned the horse south, toward the road that led over the hill to the Blackmore estates, and was gone before Eliza had fully worked out what had just happened. She stood for a moment in front of the ashes. Then she walked back toward the village to find Martha Harwick. Martha's response to the news, delivered over a kitchen table with 2 cups of very strong tea between them, was silence followed by a look of deep and complicated calculation. Lucas Hawthorne, Martha said finally. She said it the way you say the name of a geographical feature, a mountain, a river, something large and fixed and requiring careful navigation. He came to the ruin this morning, Eliza said. Before I did, apparently. He said he watched the smoke from his study. He watches a great deal from that study, Martha said. Doesn't often come down from the hill, though. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He's not... She stopped, started again. People in Ravenshire have different opinions of him. Tell me the honest one. Martha looked at her with a glint of something that might have been appreciation. He's not cruel, she said. His rents are fair, and his word is reliable, which is more than some. But he is not a man who invites people into his confidence, and he has been running those estates with a tight fist and a closed gate for 4 years, and some people find that she chose her word carefully. Cold. He didn't seem cold, Eliza said. No, Martha agreed in a tone that suggested she had filed this observation away for later consideration. He didn't, did he? Do you trust him? I trust that he means what he says, Martha said. I trust less easily that I understand why he says it. He said the arithmetic wasn't difficult, that the children need a space, and he has one. Men of his kind always have reasons they'll admit to, Martha said, and reasons they won't. She looked at Eliza steadily. That's not a warning. It's just the truth of it. I know the truth of it, Eliza said. I grew up in the same world he did, more or less. She paused. I'm going to look at the East Wing tomorrow. If it's what he says, I'm going to accept. Martha nodded slowly. There will be talk. There's already talk. There will always be talk. The question is whether the children have a school. Martha was quiet for a moment, and then she did something Eliza had not yet seen her do in 4 months of close acquaintance. She smiled. It was not an elaborate smile. Martha Harwick was not constructed for elaborate emotional displays, but it was genuine, and it reached her eyes, and it transformed her weathered face into something warmer than Ravenshire usually admitted. All right, she said. Go look at the east wing. Blackmore was not what Eliza had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to articulate beforehand precisely what she had expected. She had formed from the village's careful descriptions an image of something fortress-like, an estate turned inward, all closed gates and locked windows, wearing its owner's reclusiveness like a visible coat of armor. What she found instead, riding up the long approach road on a borrowed horse the following morning, was simply a very large house in a state of powerful, undefended beauty. It sat on a rise above the valley, constructed of the same dark northern stone as everything else in Ravenshire, but on a scale that gave the stone a different quality. Not heavy, but permanent, the way a mountain is permanent, as though it had been here before memory and intended to outlast argument. The grounds were wild in the northern way, not untended exactly, but undecorated, without the clipped hedges and formal gardens that southern estates use to demonstrate their owner's mastery over nature. Here, nature had been allowed to be itself, and the result was heather that came down almost to the drive and copper beaches against the sky, and the suggestion, everywhere, of a landscape that had made its own decisions. Lucas Hawthorne was waiting for her at the main entrance. He was dressed as he had been the previous morning, riding clothes, practical, without the social ornamentation of a man performing his rank for visitors. This, she noted, was consistent. He was not performing anything. "You found it," he said. The road was not ambiguous, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the geographic neighbor of one. He took her inside. The east wing was exactly as described. 3 large rooms, closed for years but structurally sound, with the high ceilings and good natural light of a building designed by someone who had thought about the use of space with seriousness. Dust sheets covered the furniture. The windows needed new glazing in several panels. The floors were solid oak, cold and dusty but intact. The largest room, the former library, was nearly 40 feet long with built-in shelves running the full length of 2 walls. Eliza walked the length of it without speaking. She stopped at the far end and turned. Lucas stood in the doorway, watching her with his arms crossed, with the particular quality of patience that belongs to someone accustomed to waiting on processes they cannot accelerate. "The shelves," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'd thought of that as well. How many books are left in this house?" He considered. "Several hundred at least. My father was an indiscriminate collector, bought anything that came his way and never disposed of it. Most of them have been boxed and stored in the attic." "A library," she said, half to herself. "Not just a schoolroom, a library that the village can use." He unfolded his arms. "That would be a different scale of commitment than what I proposed." "Yes," she said. "Is it a commitment you'd be willing to make?" He looked at her with the same directness he had shown at the ruin, that quality of actually considering what was being asked rather than deflecting it. "Why do you want a library? The school is the functional need." "The school is the immediate need," Eliza said. "A library is the need after that. When those children can read, and they will read, I'll see to that, what happens then? What do they read? Do they have access to anything beyond the schoolroom primers and whatever their families own, which is mostly nothing?" She turned to look at the shelves. "A man's world is the size of the books he's been allowed access to. That's as true for the children of tenant farmers in Ravenshire as it is for the sons of dukes at Eton." The silence that followed this had a different quality from his previous silences. She became aware faintly that she had said something that landed differently than she had intended, not badly, but personally, in a register she hadn't aimed for. "The books in the attic," he said finally, "will need to be catalogued before they're useful. That will take time." "I know how to catalog a library," she said. "I imagine you do." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "The wing is yours. The books are yours, or the school's, which is the same thing. I'll arrange for the window repairs this week." "I can't pay you for this," she said. "I want to say that plainly, rather than have it be a source of confusion later." "I know," he said. "I didn't propose it as a financial arrangement." "Then I want to understand what you're proposing it as." He looked at her steadily. "A neighbor helping a neighbor," he said. "That's all." She wanted to believe that was entirely true, and she mostly did. and she made a note to herself to pay attention to the ways in which it might not be, because she was a woman who had learned, recently and at some cost, the importance of not mistaking what she hoped for what was actually in front of her. "Then I accept," she said. "Thank you." The move to Blackmore's East Wing took place over the following 10 days, and it was those 10 days that began, almost without either of them noticing, because neither of them was paying attention to the right things at the right moment, to change the nature of everything. Lucas was present in ways that surprised her. She had expected, having accepted his offer, that he would execute it at the distance appropriate to a man of his station, lending a wing of his house to a charitable purpose, visible in the arrangement of things, invisible in the daily reality of them. Instead, he appeared most mornings during the work period with the unself-conscious practicality of someone who saw a task that needed doing and did not consider it beneath him to do it. He carried boxes. She found this remarkable privately. He carried boxes of books from the attic to the library room himself, alongside the 2 estate workers he had assigned to the task, without ceremony or commentary. He directed the glaziers on the window repairs with the precise, undecorative authority of someone who had made enough decisions about buildings to know what needed saying and what didn't. When she reorganized the furniture layout of the main schoolroom, twice, because the first arrangement put the morning light directly in the children's eyes, he moved the heavy desks without being asked, assessed the second arrangement, and said only, "The light is better," which was both accurate and somehow more gratifying than a more elaborate compliment would have been. They talked. That was the thing she hadn't prepared for. She had expected that whatever communication was required between them would be practical, transactional, the vocabulary of 2 people managing a project with a shared goal and separate lives. What happened instead was that the work created a context for conversation, and the conversation turned out to be the kind that neither of them had apparently been having with anyone else for a considerable period of time. He knew a great deal about northern agricultural practice and had clear, data-grounded opinions about what could be done to improve the yields of tenant farms in the region. Not abstract opinions, but working ones, based on what he had been doing with his own land for 4 years. She had been reading, among other things, on the subject of northern agricultural reform, and she had her own opinions. And on the second afternoon in the library room, sorting through a box of his father's book collection while he examined the glazing work on the north window, they had a 40-minute argument about the relative merits of drainage versus crop rotation as priorities for improving Ravenshire's struggling farms. And the argument was so entirely free of social performance, so devoid of the careful management of impressions that had characterized every important conversation she'd had in London for the past 3 years, that she found herself afterwards slightly disoriented, the way you feel when you've been running and you stop and your body doesn't immediately believe the running is over. She mentioned this to no one. She also did not mention the evening, the 4th day of the work, when she had stayed late cataloging the library books and he had stayed working at his desk at the far end of the wing, and at some point she had looked up from the catalog and found that the light outside the window had gone entirely dark and a lamp had appeared on the table beside her, placed there at some point without her noticing. And when she had gone to find him to thank him, he was in his study and had looked up from whatever he was reading and said, with a complete absence of the pointed quality that a man of lesser character would have invested in the observation, "You should eat. Mrs. Donnelly will have kept something." She ate dinner at Blackmore that night, in the kitchen with the housekeeper, which was not the appropriate venue for a lady of her standing, and was the most comfortable meal she had eaten since arriving in Ravensshire. The school opened in the East Wing on a Tuesday in early June. 23 children came on the first day, more than had ever attended the assembly room sessions at one time, brought partly by Martha Harwick's recruiting and partly by the sheer fact of the space itself, which communicated something the assembly room never had. Seriousness of purpose, permanence, the statement that this was a real place built for a real thing. Eliza stood at the front of the main schoolroom that first morning and looked at 23 faces of varying ages and expressions, cautious, bright, skeptical, eager, determinedly indifferent, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for a very long time. The first week was chaos and she loved it. The second week was slightly less chaos and she loved it differently. Lucas Hawthorne did not intrude on the school's daily life, but he was present in the estate's rhythms in ways that she became attuned to without meaning to. The sound of his horse in the courtyard in the early morning, the occasional distant voice when he was speaking to one of the estate workers, the lamp that burned in his study window late into the evenings, visible from the library room if she looked up at the right angle. She tried not to look up at the right angle too often. She was not entirely successful. What? The trouble when it began came from a direction she had been watching but had underestimated. It was a man named Robert Greer who started it. He was a farmer of the larger landowning variety, not a titled man, but substantial enough in Ravenshire's local economy to have opinions that other men listened to, and possessed of a sour, stubborn conservatism that she had first encountered when he had come to her assembly room sessions to pull his 2 sons home for spring planting, and had looked at her with an expression that made clear he found the entire enterprise of educating farm children both unnecessary and faintly suspicious. He came to Blackmore on a Thursday in late June, while she was in the library room working with the older children on reading comprehension. She heard the voices in the courtyard, his among them, carrying the particular resonance of a man who wanted to be overheard, and when she dismissed the children to independent work and stepped into the corridor, she found Lucas in the entrance hall receiving Greer with the careful composure of a man managing his own irritation. Greer's argument was not complicated. Educating farm children beyond basic literacy was a waste of time that could be spent in the fields. Bringing them to the great house was inappropriate. It gave them ideas about their station that their station could not support. And the woman running the school was a London interloper who had arrived under circumstances that Greer described, with a particular emphasis that made his meaning entirely clear, as unusual. Eliza stood in the corridor and heard all of this through the open door and did not move. The school, Lucas said, in the even, controlled tone of someone deciding how much of what they actually think is useful to say out loud, is on my property. What occurs on my property is my business. Your Grace, with respect, Greer began. I've heard your concerns, Lucas said. They're noted. The tone shifted slightly, not louder, but denser, with a quality that made the air in the corridor change perceptibly, even from where Eliza stood. Noted and declined. The school continues. There was a silence. Eliza could not see Greer's face, but she could feel the quality of his resistance through the wall. That particular stubbornness of a man unaccustomed to being told no by someone with the authority to enforce it. People are talking, Greer said. The words were precise and deliberate, a different kind of weapon than argument. About the school, and about... A pause waited with implication. Other things. People in Ravenshire, Lucas said, have always talked. It hasn't yet changed the weather or the harvest, and I don't expect it to start. Another brief silence. Good day, Mr. Greer. She heard Greer leave. She waited a moment before stepping into the entrance hall. Lucas was standing at the window, watching Greer's horse move back down the drive, with his arms behind his back, and the particular stillness of someone who has just spent energy on a controlled response and is now dealing with what the control cost. How long have you been standing in the corridor? He asked, without turning around. Long enough, she said. He turned. His expression was composed, but there was something underneath it that she had learned in the past weeks to recognize. A tightness at the jaw, a quality of restraint. It won't be only Greer, she said. You knew that when you offered the wing. Yes, he said, and you offered it anyway. The arithmetic, he said, with a very slight edge that she realized after a moment was dry humor, was not difficult. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the northern summer afternoon was moving light across the hills, and the heather was very purple, and Ravenshire was doing what Ravenshire always did, which was be itself with complete indifference to what anyone thought about it. What did he mean, she said carefully, about other things? Lucas's expression shifted in a way she could not entirely read, or rather, she could read it, and what she read was something complicated that he had made a decision not to say yet. He meant that an unmarried woman spending significant time at the estate of an unmarried man is a subject people find interesting, he said, regardless of the professional and charitable nature of what actually occurs here. And that doesn't concern you? My reputation in Ravenshire, he said, has survived 4 years of determined reclusiveness and the management of 200 tenant farms with what some people consider excessive efficiency. It will survive Robert Greer's implications. He's not only talking to you, Eliza said. He'll be talking to the families. Some of them will pull their children from the school because of it. Some might, Lucas agreed. That concerns me considerably more than what he says about either of us. Then we need, Lucas said, to give the families something more substantial than talk to hold on to. He looked at her steadily. What would that be? She thought for a moment. The answer came to her not as an inspiration, but as something she had been working toward without knowing it. The slow accumulation of all the practical thinking she had been doing since she first stood in front of that ruin on Becker Lane and understood that good intentions were not architecture. A permanent record, she said, something public and formal and undeniable. A charter for the school, a proper one with the names of the founders, the purpose, the curriculum, the funding arrangement. Something that exists on paper and can be shown to any parent who has questions. She paused. And an open day. Invite the families here. Let them see the library, the schoolroom, the books their children have access to. Let them see it themselves rather than hearing about it secondhand through Robert Greer's interpretation. Lucas was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that direct, evaluating quality that she had stopped finding unnerving somewhere around the end of the first week and had started finding, if she was being honest with herself, something she looked forward to. That's not a modest undertaking, he said. No, she agreed. Most things worth doing aren't. Something changed in his face, not dramatically, not with the emotional legibility of a man in a novel, but in the subtle, real way of an actual person encountering something that has moved them. It was brief. He looked away. I'll have the estate attorney draft a charter, he said. The open day can be arranged for a fortnight from Saturday. Good, she said. She went back to the library room and the children who were waiting for her, and she did not look at the window and the lamp inside it, or not more than once, which she considered a satisfactory exercise of self-discipline. The fortnight that followed was the hardest stretch of work she had undertaken since arriving in Ravenshire, and she had not been idle before it. She and Martha organized the open day with the precision of a military campaign, visits to every family with school-aged children in the village and the surrounding farms. Not notes delivered by servants, but actual visits, she and Martha at kitchen tables and cottage doors, speaking plainly about what the school was and what it wasn't, and answering questions without condescension or evasion. She encountered skepticism from some and hostility from others, and from Robert Greer's immediate neighbors she encountered a particular cold courtesy that was more discouraging than open opposition, because cold courtesy is harder to argue against. She argued against it anyway. She overhauled the library's catalog and organized the children's section separately, with the books arranged not by subject, but by reading level, so that a child could walk in on a Saturday morning and find a book appropriate for exactly where they were without having to ask for help or reveal their ignorance. She understood from watching her students that the most powerful obstacle to reading was not difficulty, but exposure. The simple fact of never having been in a room full of books and told, implicitly, these are for you. She was arranging the last shelf of the children's section on a Friday evening 10 days before the open day when she became aware that she was not alone in the library. She looked up. Lucas was standing in the doorway, not approaching, not speaking, simply present in the way he occasionally was, as though the house's rhythms and his own had a natural tendency to coincide at this hour. You've been here since 7 this morning, he said. I know what time it is. Do you? He looked at her with an expression she had no immediate category for. Not concern, exactly. Not quite. Something more direct than concern. You don't eat when you work. Mrs. Donnelly has mentioned it. Mrs. Donnelly is extremely well-intentioned. She's also right. Eliza straightened up and looked at the shelves, full now, organized, each book in its place. The library smelled of old paper and the beeswax she had used on the shelves, and the evening light was long and golden through the new glazed windows, and it looked, she thought, like what it was supposed to be, a room that expected to be used. It's ready, she said, and the words came out with more feeling than she intended. Lucas stepped into the room then, fully, not remaining in the doorway. He walked to the shelves she had just finished and looked at them for a moment, at the children's books arranged by level, at the colored ribbons she had tied to the shelf edges to indicate which section was which, at the small cards she had written in clear, large letters for children who were still learning to read. Stories, nature, history, mathematics. "You wrote those cards yourself," he said. "Who else would—" "You printed them in block letters rather than script," he said, "because a child who's just learning to read can't read cursive yet." He turned to look at her. "You thought about that." "Of course I thought about that," she said, slightly thrown by the observation. "That's the work." "Yes," he said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. The golden evening light moved across the library floor. Outside, a bird called once from somewhere on the estate, and the northern hills held the light in their particular obstinate way, refusing to let go of the day until the very last moment. "Why did you come north?" he asked. The question was direct but not intrusive, carrying a quality of genuine wanting to know that she had noticed in him and that was distinct from the social performance of interest. "Not the story people tell," he added. "The real answer." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the ballroom, about the relief on Adrian Caldwell's face, about standing at a library window at 2 a.m. with a book about agricultural reform and the slow, clarifying certainty that she could not stay where she was. "Because there was something here that needed doing," she said, "and because I needed something that needed doing." She paused. "Those two things turned out to be the same thing, which is perhaps the best luck of my life so far." He looked at her for a long moment, and in his face she saw something that might have been recognition, the specific, quiet recognition of a person who understands, from the inside, what it means to choose a difficult place over a comfortable one, because the difficult place is where something real exists. He didn't say whatever he was thinking. Instead he said, "Come and eat. Mrs. Donnelly will have outdone herself out of sheer spite toward my failure to enforce reasonable hours." She laughed, which surprised her. It surprised him too, slightly. She could see it. She followed him out of the library, down the corridor, toward the warm-lit kitchen and the smell of something substantial and northern and sustaining. And behind them the shelves waited in the golden light, full of books arranged with care for children who didn't yet know they were coming. The open day was 11 days away. And 3 days before it, everything nearly collapsed. A letter arrived from London. Eliza recognized the handwriting before she opened it. The same elegant, deliberate hand she had burned without finishing 4 months ago. But this time she read it to the end, because this time the words in it were different and worse, and the last line of it sat in her chest for the rest of the day, like a coal that couldn't decide whether to burn out or ignite. "I am coming north," Adrian Caldwell had written. "I need to speak with you. Please don't refuse me this." She folded the letter and placed it in her writing desk and closed the drawer and went back to work, because the children were coming in the morning and the open day was 11 days away, and there was too much to do to fall apart now. But she could feel the drawer all evening, the way you feel a wound you've been told not to touch, the way you feel the arrival of a storm before the sky has given you any visible reason to know it's coming. The past had found her address, and it was on its way. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the east bedroom at Ashgate with the drawer of her writing desk locked, and Adrian's letter inside it and the key on the nightstand beside her, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to Ravenshire breathe in the dark. The distant sound of the wind off the high moors, the occasional movement of the horses in the stable. The particular silence of a northern night that was never fully quiet, because the land itself was always making some small, persistent sound, as though it was working at something even while the rest of the world slept. She thought about the letter with the methodical, clinical attention of someone probing a wound to assess the damage before deciding how to treat it. The engagement has collapsed. He had written that plainly, without the oblique evasions that had characterized the first letter she'd received from him and burned without finishing. The heiress's fortune had been, in his words, considerably overstated by her father, which was the polished way of saying that Charles Bellows of Boston had exaggerated his railroad empire to a degree that had become impossible to conceal once the Caldwell estate attorneys began examining the actual figures. Catherine Bellows was not poor. She had a comfortable income by any reasonable measure, but she was not the solution Adrian needed. Not $40,000 a year, not even close. The engagement had been dissolved by mutual agreement, he said, quietly. Without spectacle, which Eliza thought, lying in the dark, was interesting. That he had found a way to end the second engagement quietly when he had engineered the destruction of the first with such theatrical efficiency. Perhaps, she thought, the difference was that the second dissolution did not require a performance because there was no one watching whose opinion he needed to manage. She had been the performance. She understood that now with a completeness she had only partially grasped in the ballroom 8 months ago. And then the last line, which she had read 3 times before closing the drawer. I am coming north. I need to speak with you. Please don't refuse me this. Not a question, not precisely a request, a statement of intent delivered in the grammar of appeal, which was its own kind of pressure. The pressure of a man who had always expected his feelings to constitute a prior claim on the feelings of others. She was not going to take him back. She was certain of that with the clean, unambiguous certainty that she had arrived at somewhere over the past 8 months, built not from bitterness, which was too reactive a thing to build anything solid from, but from the slow daily accumulation of a different self. A self that had taught 23 children to read in a room that smelled of ale, that had argued about drainage with a taciturn duke over boxes of books, that had stood at kitchen tables in farm workers' cottages and made her case plainly to people who had no reason to trust her, and had found, gradually, that plain speaking and showing up were their own form of persuasion. That self did not fit inside whatever space Adrian Caldwell's return was intending to offer her. She knew this the way she knew the layout of the library shelves, completely, without having to think about it. What she was less certain of was the damage his arrival would do, not to her or not primarily. She had already survived the worst thing he could publicly do to her, and she had survived it by moving north and building something real. What concerned her was the school. The open day was 8 days away. The families who were still uncertain, still listening to Robert Greer's version of events, still deciding whether this London woman and her association with the Duke of Blackmore constituted something worthy of trust or something requiring suspicion, those families would hear about Adrian Caldwell's arrival before he had been in Ravenshire 2 hours. Villages were not London. There were no useful fictions. News moved like weather. A disgraced woman's former fiancé arriving to reclaim her was not the narrative she needed circulating in Ravenshire 8 days before she needed 30 families to bring their children to an open day at a nobleman's estate. She turned onto her side and looked at the window. The northern dark was beginning, very faintly, to lighten at its edges. That long northern dawn that began earlier than you expected and took longer than you expected, and came to fullness with the unhurried inevitability of something that had no interest in your schedule. She made a decision. She was going to tell Lucas before the village heard it. That was the first thing. After that, she was going to do something that she had never done once in 8 months in Ravenshire, and that she suspected would be more difficult than everything else combined. She was going to ask for help. 2. She found him in the north field at 6:30, which was where Mrs. Donnelly told her he spent his early mornings in summer. Walking the tenant boundaries, she said, in a tone that suggested this was both admirable and slightly excessive. Eliza followed the path through the heather and came over a low rise and found him standing at the edge of a field of young barley, speaking to a tenant farmer whose name she had learned was John Collier, one of the men who had pulled his children from the assembly room sessions in spring for planting and had not yet brought them back. She stopped at a distance, not wanting to interrupt. Collier was gesturing at something in the field, a section that looked different from the rest, the barley thinner and paler with a yellow cast that even Eliza, no farmer, recognized as wrong. Lucas was listening with the focused stillness she had come to associate with him when he was taking something seriously, which was most of the time. Drainage, Lucas said when Collier finished. The east corner of this field has had that problem for 3 years. We've discussed it. Discussing it hasn't fixed it, Collier said, with a directness that walked the line between honest and confrontational. No, Lucas said. The tile drainage I asked the estate manager to arrange last autumn hasn't been laid because the men I intended to hire were engaged elsewhere. That's my failure, not yours. I'll have it corrected before winter. He paused. The affected section. Don't replant it this season. Let it lie fallow, and I'll adjust your rent accordingly for the yield loss. Collier looked at him with the careful assessment of a man deciding whether he's being managed or genuinely heard. Whatever he found in Lucas's face appeared to satisfy the question, because he nodded, a short, substantial nod, and the conversation moved to other things. Eliza waited. When Collier had gone back to his work and Lucas turned and found her standing at the top of the rise, he crossed the distance between them without hurry. "You're here before the children," he said. Not a question. "Yes." She waited until he was close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice because she wasn't going to say this loudly. "I received a letter yesterday. From Adrian Caldwell." Lucas's face did not change in any dramatic way. He looked at her steadily and waited. She told him plainly, the dissolved engagement, the failed fortune, the statement of intent at the end. She watched his face while she talked, and found in it, as she had found before in moments of difficulty, a quality of controlled attention, not performing equanimity, actually practicing it, which was a different thing. When she finished, he said, "When?" He didn't say. "Within the week, I think." "Will you see him?" "I don't see how I can refuse without it looking like fear," she said, "and I won't let him make me look afraid." "But the timing?" 8 days before the open day, Lucas said. "Yes. And Greer will hear about it." "Greer will hear about it before Adrian's horse is fully stabled," she said. Lucas turned and looked out across the barley field, the healthy sections and the pale, failed corner, with an expression she could not fully read. The morning light was doing its particular northern thing, that clear, unsparing illumination that hid nothing and softened nothing, and was, she had come to believe, one of Ravenshire's truest qualities. "Then we move the open day up," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Move it forward, from 8 days to 4. He turned back to her. "Give Greer less time to work with. Give the families the direct experience of the school before his version of events has time to settle. 4 days is not enough time to... What isn't finished in 4 days?" he said. "The library's ready. The schoolroom is ready. The books are cataloged. The children are already there every morning, and their parents can see the work in their faces if they choose to look." He held her gaze. "What else needs to be done that 4 days won't accomplish?" She opened her mouth and closed it again, because she was running the list in her mind with rapid, honest efficiency, and the uncomfortable answer was that he was right. The open day had been scheduled for 8 days hence because 8 days felt sufficient and comfortable and prepared. 4 days was tight and exposed and real. It was also, she recognized, correct. "You're thinking like a soldier," she said. "I'm thinking like someone who has lived in Ravensshire long enough to know that Robert Greer's opinion spreads faster than a drainage problem," he said, and she saw briefly the dry edge of humor that occasionally appeared in him like a seam of different stone in a cliff face, unexpected and more interesting than what surrounded it. 4 days, he said again. "I'll have notices posted in the village today. You send Martha to the farms." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, and she heard in her own voice that she was not asking about the open day. She was asking about the letter, about the recalibration of the schedule, about the steady, practical deployment of everything at his disposal in service of something she had built, in a place he had opened to her, without once making her feel the weight of the obligation. He held her gaze for a long moment. The barley moved in the morning wind. "Because it matters," he said quietly, "and because you've been fighting for it alone long enough." She had nothing to say to that, which was unusual enough to be disorienting. She nodded once, the short, substantial nod she had learned from Ravensshire, which did not ornament what it meant, and she went to find Martha. The 4 days were, in a word, brutal. She and Martha covered ground that should have taken a week in half the time, moving through Ravenshire's farms and cottages with the focused intensity of women who understood that the window they were working within was closing from both ends. Eliza knocked on doors she had already knocked on twice and did not apologize for knocking again. She sat across from mothers who were skeptical and fathers who were non-committal and translated the school's reality into language that would travel. Not the language of charity or improvement or the benevolent intervention of the educated classes in the lives of the less fortunate, which was both condescending and false, but something simpler and more accurate. Your child can read better than they could in March. Come see what that looks like. Robert Greer's influence was visible everywhere she went, in the careful phrasing of questions that were really challenges, in the specific doubts people raised about the arrangement at Blackmore, in the way certain men looked at her with a measuring quality that had nothing to do with the school and everything to do with the implications Greer had been working to establish. She answered all of it directly. She did not hedge, did not soften, did not perform the conciliating deference that would have made them more comfortable at the cost of the truth. She was tired in a way that went past physical by the evening of the third day. She was sitting in the library at Blackmore, the lamp burning low, revising the order of the open day's presentation for the fourth time, when the door opened and Lucas came in carrying 2 cups of tea with the matter-of-fact air of a man delivering supplies to a position under siege. He set one in front of her and sat across the table without asking and looked at what she was writing. "Stop revising it," he said. "It's not right yet." "It doesn't need to be right," he said. "It needs to be real. The parents coming tomorrow aren't coming to hear a perfect presentation. They're coming to see the room and the books and the teacher and decide if those things are what their children deserve." He looked at her. "You are what their children deserve. The room and the books are already sufficient. Stop polishing the wrong thing." She put down her pen. She was more tired than she had realized, and the tiredness was making the edges of things less distinct, including, she found, the careful distance she usually maintained around the question of what Lucas Hawthorne's presence meant to her and what she intended to do about it. "He'll be here soon," she said, not needing to clarify who he was. "I know. He'll make it about himself. Whatever he says to me, however he frames it, underneath all of it, Adrian has never understood how to make anything about someone else." Lucas was quiet. His tea sat untouched in front of him. "What will you say to him?" "No," she said, plainly and without long explanation, because long explanations invite negotiation, and I'm done negotiating with him. "And if he makes a scene?" "He won't." She was certain of this, actually. "He's a man who understands the value of appearances. He made a spectacle of ending things in London because London was watching and the announcement served his purpose. Up here, a scene serves nothing." She paused. "He'll be courteous. He'll be regretful. He'll be very convincing about how much he has suffered because men like Adrian always suffer very legibly when it serves them to do so." Lucas looked at her steadily. "You're not afraid of him," he said. "No. But you're afraid of something." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp made their shadows long on the library walls. Through the window, the last of the northern evening light was doing its long, stubborn thing with the sky. "I'm afraid," she said finally, "that after everything, the school, the families, the work, it will be the story that follows me here that people remember. Not what I built. Just the version of me that was left behind at a ball in London." She looked at him. "That's what Greer is using, not facts. A story." "Then we give them a different story," Lucas said. "Tomorrow." She looked at him across the lamp-lit table, at this man who had opened his house and his books and his early morning conversations and his dry, careful humor and his steady presence to something she was building, and she thought about Martha's words from the beginning. Men of his kind always have reasons they'll admit to and reasons they won't. She thought she was beginning to understand the reasons he hadn't admitted to, and the understanding sat in her chest with a warmth that she acknowledged privately and did not yet know what to do with. "Thank you," she said, "for the 4 days, for the notices, for, She gestured, a slightly helpless gesture that encompassed the room and the books and the school and the morning in the barley field and all of it. "Don't thank me," he said. "Teach the children." She picked up her pen, looked at her revised presentation, and set the pen back down. He was right. She was polishing the wrong thing. She drank her tea instead. The open day came on a Saturday that Ravenshire delivered with its characteristic refusal of sentiment, cold, clear, and bright in the specific unsparing way of northern summer, which was generous with light and economical with warmth and expected you to be adequately dressed. 41 people came. Eliza had hoped for 30 and prepared for 20 and stood at the entrance to the east wing at 9 in the morning watching families arrive in a steady, river-like flow that made Martha, standing beside her, exhale a long, satisfied breath. They came in cautiously at first, the way animals enter an unfamiliar space, reading it with the whole body before committing the feat. They looked at the library shelves with expressions that moved through surprise towards something more complicated. The particular face of a person confronting a thing they want and had not allowed themselves to believe they could have. Eliza watched a farmer's wife with 3 children run her calloused hand along a shelf of books at children's eye level. Just touch the spines, that slow contact. And she had to look away because the expression on the woman's face was too undefended to observe directly. She spoke for 20 minutes about the school, not the presentation she had revised 4 times and abandoned, simply what she told people when she meant it, what the children were learning, what she planned to teach, what the library was for and who it was for, and what she believed about education, which was that it was not a gift the fortunate gave the less fortunate, but a right that every child in Ravenshire was owed by simple virtue of having been born there. Several of the men in the room shifted when she said right. She noted it and did not soften it. Lucas stood at the back of the room throughout. He did not speak. He had told her, when she'd asked whether he intended to address the parents, that it was not his school and it was not his day to speak, which she had found so unexpectedly right that she hadn't had words for it immediately. He was simply present, in the way that a steady, reliable structure is present, not demanding attention, but providing it, as a background condition. Afterward, in the library room, she watched parents look at books with their children, and watched older children show younger ones how the sections were organized, and heard questions being asked that were genuine, about the schedule, the days, the subjects, rather than the performance of skepticism that Greer had been teaching. She heard him once, at the far end of the library, speaking to 2 of the tenant farmers he was closest to in the village. She couldn't hear the words, but she watched the farmers look around the room, at the shelves, at the children, at the morning light coming through the new glazed windows, and she watched whatever Greer was saying fail to find purchase against the evidence of what was directly in front of them. By noon, 14 new families had committed to sending their children to the school. By the time the last family left in the early afternoon, she had 31 students enrolled for the following Monday. She sat down on a window bench in the empty library after everyone had gone and was briefly, completely without performance, overwhelmed. Martha found her there. 31, Martha said. 31, Eliza confirmed. Martha sat down beside her. They sat in comfortable, exhausted quiet for a moment. "He's here," Martha said then. Eliza went very still. "Where?" "Arrived at the Ravenshire Inn this morning. I heard from the innkeeper's daughter when I was leaving." A pause. "He was asking after you." Eliza closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them, stood up, smoothed her skirts, and found, somewhere in the wreckage of a 4-day sprint toward today and the successful end of it, a remaining reserve of composure that she had not known she still had. "Then I'd better go to him," she said, "before he comes to me." That's. He was staying at the Ravenshire Crown, which was the village's only inn, and not a place that a London duke would normally choose without having been given no alternative, which told her something about the state of his resources that she filed away without particular satisfaction. He had chosen a private sitting room, at least, and she found him there an hour after Martha's news, changed from travel clothes into something more assembled. The Adrian Caldwell surface reconfigured toward the presentation she remembered from 100 London drawing rooms. Handsome, composed, carrying the particular authority of a man who had always found a room organized itself toward him and expected it to continue. He stood when she entered. He looked at her, fully, a long look, and something moved across his face that she recognized as genuine. He had always had the capacity for genuine feeling. That had never been the problem. The problem had been that genuine feeling in Adrian Caldwell had never yet been sufficient to override a more advantageous calculation. "Eliza," he said. "Adrian." She sat in the chair nearest the door, not the one arranged near the fireplace that would have put her beside him. The distance was specific and intentional, and he registered it. "You look," he began. "Say what you came to say," she said. "Please, I have work to return to." He absorbed this, sat down across from her. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely still. A small thing, significant in a man of his control. "I came because I was wrong," he said. "I don't offer that as an excuse or as leverage. I offer it as the plain truth, which I should have told you a year ago." He held her gaze with the practiced directness of a man who had rehearsed this. "I chose badly. I chose with my estates in mind, and not my—" He stopped. "Not myself. And I have spent 8 months understanding exactly what I threw away, and exactly how little Catherine Bellows's fortune was ever going to give me what I actually needed." "What you needed?" Eliza said carefully. "You," he said, straight at her. The room was quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, Ravenshire went about its Saturday afternoon with complete indifference. She looked at him. She looked at the genuine feeling in his face. It was there. She did not doubt it. She had never been the kind of woman who doubted the sincerity of the man in front of her, and she wasn't going to start now. What she doubted was what the sincerity was attached to, whether it was attached to her, specifically to Eliza Whitmore, the person who had spent 8 months in the Northern Hills building something that had nothing to do with him, or whether it was attached to the idea of her, which was smaller and more convenient, and could be packed into his life at Norley without requiring him to change anything fundamental. "Do you know what I did today?" she asked. He blinked at the shift. No. "I opened a school," she said. "A real one. With 31 children enrolled and a library of 300 books and the use of an east wing of one of the finest estates in Ravenshire." She kept her voice even. "I spent 4 months building it from nothing, in a borrowed room that smelled of ale, against the active opposition of a man who wanted the village families to believe that I was a fallen London woman using charitable pretense to improve my social position." She looked at him steadily. "I won today, Adrian. I won because I stayed and because I worked and because I had an ally who believed in what I was building before he had any reason to." A pause. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Eliza, but—" "I'm asking whether you understand," she said, not as a rebuke, as a question. He looked at her for a long time. She could see him processing it. The school, the wing, the library, the details of a life he had not imagined when he walked into the sitting room. She could see, also, the moment when he understood the shape of the other name in everything she had said. The ally, the east wing, the man who believed before he had reason. "Hawthorne," he said, quiet, specific. "Yes," she said. "Is it—" He stopped, started again with visible effort. "Are you—" "That's not the question you should be asking me," she said. "The question you should be asking me is whether I want to return to London and Norley Park and the life you're offering, which looks, from where I'm standing, like a very good version of everything I left." She met his eyes. "The answer is no. Not because I'm angry with you, though I was, and not because I'm punishing you, because I'm not, but because I've become a person here that doesn't fit inside that life anymore, and I have no intention of making myself smaller to accommodate it." The silence was long. Adrian Caldwell looked at the woman across from him with an expression that had moved past rehearsal into something she couldn't categorize. Not quite loss, not quite understanding, something in between that was perhaps the beginning of one and the end of the other. "He's a better man than I am," he said, finally. She didn't answer that. "Is he?" he pressed, quietly, without aggression. She thought of the barley field at 6:30 in the morning. The lamp appeared on the table in the library. The boxes of books carried without ceremony. 4 days. "Move the open day. You've been fighting for it alone long enough." "Yes," she said, simply. Adrian nodded. A slow nod. The nod of a man accepting a verdict he had probably known before he arrived, but had needed to hear. He looked at his hands for a moment, and she saw something in his face that was, she thought, the most honest she had ever seen him. The face of a man understanding, at last, the full weight of what he had traded away, and finding it heavier than the other thing had turned out to be worth. "Then I wish you well," he said. "I mean that." "I believe you," she said. "I hope you find your way through the estates, Adrian, genuinely." She stood. He stood. There was a moment that in another life would have been something else, a last possibility, a door left open. But in this life it was simply a door closing, and she felt it close with the clean, permanent feeling of a decision that had already been made for 8 months and was only now receiving its formal confirmation. She left the sitting room and walked out into the afternoon. The northern air hit her with its characteristic lack of ceremony, cold and clean and absolutely indifferent. She stood on the cobblestones outside the Ravenshire Crown for a moment, breathing it. Then she started walking. Not toward Ashgate, toward the road that led over the hill, toward Blackmoor. She was halfway up the drive when she heard the horse behind her and turned. Lucas came down from the direction of the north fields at a canter and pulled up beside her with the fluid, unhurried ease of a man who had been on horseback since before she was awake. He looked at her for a moment, reading her face with the specific attention she had come to trust above almost any other form of observation she knew. "Well?" he said. "Done," she said. Something moved in his face, not relief, or not only relief. Something more than that, carefully held. He dismounted. They stood on the drive between the heather and the copper beeches, the horse warm and patient between them, and she looked at this man in the clear northern light that hid nothing and softened nothing, and she thought about Martha's words from the very beginning, reasons they'll admit to and reasons they won't. She decided she was finished waiting for him to admit to the second kind. "Lucas," she said. "Yes, I need to tell you something." "Tell me." "I'm not—" She stopped, found the right words, started again. "I'm not in the habit of saying things I'm not certain of. I've learned this year the cost of building on uncertain ground, so I want to be precise." She held his gaze. "I think I am falling in love with you. I don't say that as a request for anything. I say it because it's true, and because I'm done managing the truth to protect my own dignity. You can do with it what you like." The silence was the longest of them. A bird crossed the sky above the copper beeches. The horse exhaled slowly. Lucas looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Had never seen on anyone before, actually, because it was too unguarded to be social and too specific to be general. It was the face of a man who has been holding something very carefully for a long time and has just been given permission to put it down. He opened his mouth, and then, before he could speak, before whatever was in his face could become words, the sound reached them. It came from the direction of the village, shouting, and underneath the shouting, a lower, more continuous sound that she identified a half second after she heard it, because she had heard it once before in May on Becker Lane. Fire. She spun. Lucas was already turning, both of them looking toward the village, toward the dark smear of smoke beginning to rise against the clear northern sky. And in the specific terrible angle of it, in the direction it was rising from, she felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. The smoke was rising from the direction of Blackmoor's east wing. She ran. Lucas was on his horse before she had taken 10 steps, and the sound of the hooves on the gravel drive was the sound of everything she had built in 8 months being tested in the most final, unambiguous way that Ravenshire knew how to test a thing. The smoke was getting darker, and somewhere behind her, unspoken, the most important words of her life were still hanging in the cold northern air, waiting for a moment that the fire had not permitted them. She ran the full length of the drive and did not feel her legs. Later, she would not be able to account for the time between seeing the smoke and arriving at the East Wing entrance. It existed in her memory as a kind of compressed, frameless panic, the way extreme moments sometimes do, stripped of their sequential logic and remembered only as sensation. The gravel under her boots, the cold air burning in her lungs, the smoke darkening against the sky with the terrible, purposeful velocity of something feeding well. What she found when she arrived was not, by the worst measure of things, catastrophic. Not yet. But it was close enough to catastrophic that the distinction felt academic. The fire had started in the corridor connecting the east wing to the main house, a stretch of the building that had not been part of the renovation, where the walls still held the original pine paneling from 30 years of neglect, dry as kindling and twice as willing. A lamp had fallen. She learned this later, from the estate worker who had been carrying it and who stood in the courtyard with scorched hands and the expression of a man still processing what had happened. And the paneling had caught with the enthusiasm of material that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity for 3 decades. The schoolroom itself was not yet burning. The library was not yet burning. The corridor between them and the main house was fully involved, and the fire was moving. Lucas had arrived seconds before her on horseback, had dismounted running, and was already directing the estate workers with the focused, stripped-down authority of a man who had made a rapid and accurate assessment and was acting on it without the luxury of second-guessing. He had a chain of men with buckets from the stable yard. He had two others pulling furniture clear of the corridor entrance. He was doing 5 things at once, with the physical efficiency of someone whose body had taken charge because the emergency was too fast for deliberation. Eliza stopped in the courtyard, breathing hard, and looked at the east wing with the same rapid, honest eye she had used on the schoolhouse ruin in January. Not hoping, not dreading, simply seeing. The corridor was the danger. The corridor was also the path. If the fire reached the schoolroom and the library, the books she had spent 4 months cataloging, the slates and primers and the colored shelf markers for children who were just learning to read, all of it would go the way of the old schoolhouse on Becker Lane, and this time there would be no east wing to replace it. She did not think about the books as objects. She thought about Thomas Harwick, 9 years old, reading a full sentence aloud in the steady voice of someone who had just figured out how the world works. She thought about 31 children arriving on Monday. She went in. Not into the corridor, she was not reckless, she was calculating, and the corridor was past the point of a single person with a bucket making any useful difference. She went into the east wing through the far entrance, the one that opened directly into the library from the outside, that she had used every morning for weeks. She pushed the door, found it unlocked as she had left it that morning, and went in. The smoke was already in the room, not thick, not yet, but present, a gray thinning of the air that carried the specific acrid edge of burning pine and something chemical she couldn't identify. The library shelves stood exactly as she had left them. The colored ribbons, the small printed cards, the children's books organized by reading level, the hundreds of boxes she had cataloged over weeks of evenings by lamplight. She began moving books. It was not a sophisticated plan. It was the only plan available. She pulled books from the shelves in armfuls, not selectively, not prioritizing, just moving them, carrying them to the far exterior wall, to the window she had unlatched and pushed wide open, passing them out to— She looked up. The farmer's wife, who had run her calloused hand along the shelf at the open day that morning, and who was now standing outside the window with her sleeves rolled and her hands out, and an expression of absolute, uncomplicated determination. Eliza didn't know her name. She had not yet learned her name. "Take them," Eliza said. "Put them anywhere that's clear." "Yes," the woman said, and took the books. Then there were 2 people at the window. Then 4. She didn't look up to count them. She was moving between the shelves and the window in a rhythm that became its own momentum, armful after armful, the smoke in the room thickening slowly, but not yet urgently. And outside the window, a small, self-organized assembly of Ravenshire people were stacking books in the courtyard grass with the careful efficiency of people who understood without being told that these particular objects mattered. She didn't know when the children arrived. She became aware of them at some point. Young voices outside the window, the specific energy of children given a task they can accomplish. Passing books hand to hand in a chain from the window toward the courtyard, away from the building, and she thought, somewhere in the corner of her mind, that was still capable of thought beyond the immediate task. They came back. After the open day, they came back. She was on the far end of the children's section when the smoke changed. It thickened suddenly, not gradually, not with warning, with the abrupt total quality of a door opening between 2 rooms that had been kept separate. She heard something in the corridor, a sound like a long exhale, which was the sound of a fire finding new oxygen, and she understood with animal clarity that the corridor had just progressed from bad to something worse. "Get out!" someone shouted from the courtyard. "Lady Whitmore, get out now!" She looked at the shelf in front of her, half the children's section still in place. She made a precise, rapid calculation, the kind that happens in the body rather than the mind, and grabbed the remaining books from the nearest 2 shelves in a single sweeping armful that was too large to carry cleanly and didn't care, moving to the window as the smoke behind her became something she could feel rather than just see, warm and purposeful against the back of her neck. She pushed the books through the window. Hands took them. Then hands took her. Lucas's hands, from outside, catching her arms as she came through the window with the complete lack of ceremony of a man who had decided that whatever she thought she was doing was done and she was coming outside now. And she came, because she had passed the last of the books, and there was nothing left to argue with him about. She landed in the grass outside with considerably less elegance than she would have preferred, and stood up immediately because she was not going to sit on the grass in front of an audience. The library was still smoking through the open window, but it was not burning. She looked at the building, at the corridor section, which was heavily involved in being fought with everything the bucket chain could provide, at the east wing itself, where the fire had not yet broken through from the corridor into the library or the schoolroom, because she understood this now, seeing it from outside, because the corridor's connecting door was solid oak rather than pine, and solid oak burned differently, burned slower, bought time. Lucas appeared beside her. He was smoke-stained, his coat abandoned somewhere, and he looked at her with an intensity that bypassed all the careful management of expression she had learned to read in him. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." "Are the schoolroom—" "Not reached yet. We have the corridor door. If the bucket chain holds, it will hold," she said. She looked at the courtyard, where the chain of men was steady, buckets moving with a rhythm that had found itself and was not breaking. And beyond them, at the grass, a landscape she had not expected. 36 people, adults and children, families from the open day, and faces she recognized from 4 months of knocking on doors, farmers and cottagers, and Martha Harwick moving through the organized chaos with her basket on her arm and her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. And everywhere, stacks of books, her books, the school's books, arranged in the grass with the focused care of people who had moved them because they understood what they were. John Collier, the tenant farmer from the North Field, was building a second-tier stack with the methodical expertise of someone who had loaded wagons all his life and knew how to keep things stable. His daughter, 12 years old, enrolled for Monday, was beside him, passing books up with both hands. Robert Greer was not there. She noted that and noted also that his absence constituted a form of information she would consider later when the fire was out. For now, the fire was not out. "The corridor door," she said. "If it fails, then we lose the corridor and save the wing," Lucas said. "The bucket chain is on the corridor. The wing is what we're protecting." He looked at her steadily, smoke dark and utterly certain. "It's going to hold." It held. The fire burned itself through the corridor section in the course of 2 hours. 2 hours that felt both longer than any comparable period of her life and strangely, intimately clear in memory. The smell of it, the heat, the rhythm of the bucket chain. The people in the courtyard who had stayed without being asked. The books in the grass, the specific sound that a fire makes when it begins, finally, to lose its argument with everything being thrown against it. The oak corridor door did not fail. It scorched. It warped in its frame so thoroughly that it would never open cleanly again. But it did not fail, and the fire, denied access to the dry paneling of the east wing beyond it, found nothing further to feed on in the stone corridor walls and spent itself against them instead. When the last serious flames were out and the bucket chain dissolved into the quieter work of dousing the remaining hot spots, Eliza sat on the stone steps of the east wing's exterior entrance and permitted herself, for the first time in 2 hours, to breathe without purpose. Her dress was ruined. Her hands were shaken and smoke-darkened, and there was a long scrape on her left forearm from the window frame that she hadn't felt at the time and was beginning to feel now. Her hair had come down entirely at some point in the proceedings, and she was not currently capable of caring about this. Martha sat beside her and handed her water from a flask without speaking, which was the most eloquent thing Martha had ever done. She drank. She looked at the courtyard. The books were still in the grass. 34 people, she counted, automatically, because she was a teacher and counting was reflexive, were sitting or standing in the evening light, talking in the low, exhausted way of people who have come through something together and are still in the immediate aftermath of it. Some of the children were asleep on the grass beside the book stacks, with the sudden, absolute unconsciousness that children achieve when an exciting thing has concluded and the body decides it is done. John Collier was talking to Lucas near the stable yard entrance. She could not hear the words, but she could see the quality of the exchange. Collier's voice quiet and direct, Lucas listening with that focused attention. and then Collier saying something that made Lucas look up and across the courtyard toward her. She looked away. She looked at the books instead, at the organized stacks in the grass, at the colored shelf markers visible between the pages where they had been used as improvised bookmarks by the people carrying them out, at the small printed cards, stories, nature, history, mathematics, lying in the grass near the base of one stack, muddy at one corner but intact. The farmer's wife, whose name she did not know, was sitting across the courtyard. She caught Eliza's eye. She looked at the book stacks, and then at Eliza, and she nodded. The same short, substantial nod that Ravenshire used for things it didn't dress up in words. Eliza nodded back. Yes. The books went back on the shelves on Sunday. Eliza had expected to do this work alone, or with Martha and perhaps one or two of the estate workers. What she found when she arrived at the East Wing at 8 in the morning was that 8 people had arrived before her. The farmer's wife, whose name, Eliza finally learned, was Hannah Collier, John's wife, had come with 2 of her daughters. The Harwick boys were there, including Thomas, who was 9 and had read his first full sentence in the assembly room and who approached the book-carrying task with the focused gravity of someone engaged in important work. 2 other families from the village whose children were enrolled for Monday, and an older man she had seen at the open day but had not spoken to, a retired estate manager named Briggs, who appeared with a measuring tape and a pencil and spent the morning checking the shelf structures for smoke damage with the efficient thoroughness of someone who knew what he was looking for. She stood in the library doorway and looked at all of this and felt something move through her that she was not immediately able to name. Something past gratitude and past vindication, past the particular relief of a thing not lost that you were afraid of losing. Something that lived in the territory where those things had been and had been replaced by something denser and more durable. She had come to Ravenshire as an outsider. She had been resisted and doubted and subjected to the active campaign of a man who had wanted her marginalized, and she had built her school anyway, and last night those same families had pulled her books through a window and stacked them in the grass and stayed until the fire was out, and come back the next morning to put them right. This was not charity. It was not sympathy. It was not even precisely acceptance. It was something more mutual than acceptance, something that required both parties to have given real things and received real things in return. She went into the library and began working. It took 4 hours. By noon, the shelves were restocked. Not in the original order, which was lost, but in a new order that Eliza reorganized as she went, the children working beside her as she placed books and explained the logic of where each one went, so that they knew it, so that the organization of the library was not a secret held by the teacher, but a system understood by the children who would use it. Thomas Harwick cataloged the restored nature section with the focused pride of someone who has been given a task that matters and knows it. She was on the last section when Lucas appeared in the doorway. He had the estate attorney with him, a dry, precise man named Mr. Featherstone, who carried a leather satchel and looked at everything with the evaluating eye of someone accustomed to assessing value in adverse circumstances. Lucas spoke briefly to Featherstone, who went to look at the corridor damage and left them. Lucas came into the library. He looked at the restored shelves, at the children working, at Eliza on her knees reshelving the last section of the catalog. He crouched down beside her, which was not what she expected, and picked up a book from the pile she hadn't placed yet. He looked at the title, The Natural History of the British Isles, 1831, his father's bookplate on the inside cover. He set it on the shelf at the correct position without being told. She had explained the catalog logic to the children this morning, and he had apparently been listening from the doorway at some point, or he had simply worked it out himself, which was also possible. Featherstone says the corridor damage is structural but repairable, he said. 6 weeks of work, perhaps 8. The East Wing itself is sound. I know, she said. I looked this morning. Of course you did. There was the dry edge again. She heard it, and something in her chest loosened slightly because its presence meant that the quality of things between them was intact, was continuing, had not been altered by the events of the previous afternoon into something different from what it had been when she said what she had said on the drive. She placed the last book. The shelf was full. The library was whole. She sat back on her heels and looked at it, and he looked at it beside her, and the children moved around them with the unself-conscious energy of people occupied with purpose. I said something to you on the drive, she said. Before the fire. I know, he said. You didn't answer. He was quiet for a moment. Beside them, Thomas Harwick read the spine of a book aloud in the careful, precise voice of a child who has learned to trust the sounds the letters make, and placed it correctly on the shelf and looked deeply satisfied with himself. I didn't answer, Lucas said, because the fire started before I could. He turned to look at her. Close. In the way that the small space they were both occupying made inevitable, and in the clear morning light of the repaired library windows with the northern summer coming through the new glass, his face held nothing back in a way that she had come to understand, over months, was not a common quality in a man of his world. I'll answer now if you want. Tell me, she said. I have been, he said carefully, as though the words required precision rather than speed, building walls around this estate and this life for 4 years because I was afraid that what I lost before, what I let go of, what I failed to hold, was the result of something in me rather than something in the circumstances. Something that would repeat. He looked at the shelves, at the books, at the children, at everything she had built in his house. I watched you work, he said, every morning. I watched you walk into a room full of children who had no reason to trust you and earn their trust one day at a time. And I watched you stand in front of Robert Greer's opposition and not yield an inch. And I watched you run into a burning building for a library full of books you'd cataloged by hand. He looked at her. I don't believe anymore that the problem is in me. I think I was simply waiting for someone worth dismantling the walls for. The library was very quiet. The children, with the instinctive social perception of people who have not yet learned to pretend they're not listening, had found tasks at the far end of the room. Eliza looked at this man, steady, undecorated, precise in the way that mattered, and thought about the ballroom in London, and the 3-second look across the room, and the relief on a different man's face, and the version of herself that had stood at that window with untouched champagne and refused to fall apart. She thought about the 8 months between that night and this morning, all the daily unspectacular work of becoming someone different. Or not different, she corrected herself, more herself, which was not the same thing. I think, she said, that you are the most honest person I have met in several years of living among people who are very good at the performance of honesty. She held his gaze. And I think I'd like to know what happens next, between us. If you're willing. I'm willing, he said, very simply. The way he said most things that mattered. They were still crouching by the last bookshelf when Thomas Harwick approached with a book in each hand and a 9-year-old's complete indifference to atmosphere. Miss Whitmore, he said, where does Principles of Natural Philosophy go? It doesn't have a color. She looked at the book. It didn't have a color. It was one she hadn't cataloged yet, had missed in the reorganization. She took it, looked at the spine, looked at the shelves. Blue section, she said. Natural philosophy sits between natural history and mathematics. She pointed. There, between Brewster and Faraday. Thomas took it back, went to the shelf, found the position, placed the book with the focused correctness of someone who has learned that things have proper places and considers it their personal responsibility to know them. Lucas watched him and said nothing. But she felt beside her the quality of his silence, full rather than empty, present in the way that mattered. And she thought that this, exactly this, was what she had been trying to build since January. Not just a room full of books, not just a school with 31 children enrolled for Monday, but a place where the work of learning was taken seriously by everyone in the room, and where the adults held it as carefully as the children did, and where the difference between what existed before and what existed now could be measured in a 9-year-old's voice reading a spine aloud and knowing where it belonged. Robert Greer came to Blackmore on Monday morning. She had expected him eventually, had in fact prepared for him in the specific way you prepare for weather you cannot prevent but can adequately dress for, but his timing was particular. Monday morning was the first day of the new enrollment. 31 children were arriving at 9 o'clock. She was in the schoolroom arranging the desks in the configuration she had finally settled on, 3 group tables rather than rows, because she had found that children learned more when they could see each other's faces, when Mrs. Donnelly appeared in the doorway. Mr. Greer at the entrance, Mrs. Donnelly said, in the tone of someone reporting a mildly unpleasant atmospheric condition. "Tell him I'll be with him in 10 minutes, Eliza said. She finished the desks, then she went. Greer was in the entrance hall wearing his good coat. This was significant. He had dressed for a formal call rather than a working visit, which meant he had decided how this conversation was going to be structured before arriving. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is committed to delivering it. "Lady Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Greer." She did not invite him to sit. "The children will be arriving shortly, so I have a limited time this morning. Is there something specific I can help you with?" He adjusted his weight slightly. "I've come to say something directly," he said, which was, she thought, the most honest opening he had managed in their entire acquaintance. "I was wrong about the school." She looked at him. "I was wrong," he said again, as though the words needed repetition to be fully real. "About what it was. What you intended." He paused. "My children's mother died 4 years ago. I have 2 boys. They needed—" He stopped, started again. "I watched what happened Saturday night, the families that came, what they did." His jaw tightened briefly. "I sent my boys here this morning. They're outside." A silence. "They're very welcome," Eliza said. Carefully. Without triumph, because triumph was not what this moment required, and because she was a woman who had spent 8 months understanding the difference between winning and building something. He nodded. That Ravenshire nod, short, substantial, the full weight of what wasn't being said compressed into a single movement of the head. He put his hat on and turned toward the door. He stopped. "What you did Saturday," he said, with his back half turned. "Going in for the books." "Yes. My oldest boy, James, he told me this morning." Greer's voice changed register slightly, the controlled quality of it thinning just enough to show the thing underneath. "He said the book he was carrying out was the one you gave him at the assembly room, the one he'd been reading at home." A pause. "He carried it out first, before the others." She said nothing. Her throat did something she managed. Greer left. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment, alone, in the stone quiet of a house that had been closed for years and was now incrementally opening. She could hear, outside, the sound of children arriving, voices, footsteps on the drive, the particular rising energy of a group of young people who know they are going somewhere that is for them. She went to the schoolroom window and looked out at the drive. 31 children, plus 2 boys she didn't recognize yet, walking beside their father toward the East Wing entrance. The older one, James, she assumed, with a book under his arm. Carrying it, she thought, the way you carry something you retrieved from a fire. Lucas was standing at the far end of the entrance drive, speaking to Collier and 2 other tenant farmers. He looked up and found her at the window, and in the particular northern morning light that hid nothing and softened nothing, his face held the expression she had seen in the library the day before, full and present and not managing itself. She pressed her fingers briefly against the glass, the way she had pressed them against the cold carriage window 8 months ago, arriving in Ravenshire and not knowing what it would become. Then she turned and went to the front of the schoolroom to begin the first day. 33 children found their places. She looked at their faces, cautious and bright and skeptical and eager, and one small girl in the front who had already opened a book before the lesson began and appeared to have forgotten she was in a room with other people. And she felt the thing settle again, the same thing that had settled on the first day of the East Wing school, but deeper now, more permanent, carrying the weight of everything that had threatened it and hadn't moved it. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore, they answered in the ragged, overlapping chorus of 33 people who had not yet learned to do this in unison. "We have new students today," she said. "James and—" She looked at the younger Greer boy, who was perhaps 7, solemn-faced and alert, sitting very straight as though his posture could perform the seriousness with which he intended to approach education. "William," the boy said. "James and William." She looked at the class. "Who would like to show them how we begin?" Thomas Harwick's hand went up immediately. Of course it did. She called on him, and he stood, and he began, and the school that she had built from a ruin in a borrowed room and 4 months of unspectacular daily persistence, and a fire that hadn't managed to take it down, the school that had been doubted and opposed and nearly lost twice, was simply, undeniably, irrevocably real. Outside, the northern summer held the light in the hills with its characteristic refusal to let go of anything before it was absolutely done. And at the end of the drive, Lucas Hawthorne stood with the tenant farmers of Ravenshire, talking about drainage and crops and the specific practical work of keeping land and people productive. And the walls he had built 4 years ago to protect himself from a loss he had misunderstood were already, in all the ways that mattered, down. There was still work ahead. She knew that. There were walls to repair and a corridor to rebuild, and Robert Greer's older opinions moving through Ravenshire like water finding the old channels. And there were things between herself and Lucas that had been named but not yet fully made real. And there was the question of her father and London and what the future looked like from the vantage of something she had built rather than inherited. But 33 children were in the schoolroom behind her, and the books were back on the shelves, and the morning was clear and cold and indifferent and completely, entirely hers. The corridor was rebuilt in 7 weeks. Eliza marked the progress the way she marked most things now. Not by the calendar, which was an abstraction, but by the concrete evidence of change accumulating in the physical world around her. The smell of fresh plaster replacing the smell of ash. The sound of the carpenter's tools in the morning where there had been the sound of nothing for weeks. The corridor door, which had warped beyond saving, replaced by a new one in solid oak that Lucas had ordered cut from timber on the estate itself, which she thought, when she learned this, was the right material choice for a reason she couldn't have fully articulated but felt with certainty. The school did not stop while the work continued. She taught around it, through it, with the calm persistence of someone who had learned that circumstances were rarely the obstacle they appeared to be when you were looking at them from the outside. The children adapted with the effortless pragmatism of people too young to have developed a strong attachment to ideal conditions. They carried their slates to the library when the plaster dust was too heavy in the schoolroom. They did mathematics in the courtyard on fine days, sitting in the grass with their copybooks on their knees, and Eliza discovered that fractions were considerably easier to explain with a handful of pebbles on real ground than with a diagram on a slate, which she filed away as a pedagogical observation of genuine value. September came, and with it the particular quality of northern autumn that was nothing like autumn anywhere else. Not the gentle decorative thing that happened in the southern counties, where the leaves turned in polite gradations and the light softened apologetically. Ravenshire's autumn arrived like a statement. The copper beeches on the Blackmore Drive went the color of old iron. The heather dropped its purple overnight and became something brown and stubborn and beautiful in its own stripped-down way, and the sky lowered itself with the matter-of-fact determination of a season that intended to be taken seriously. Eliza walked through it every morning and found it, without surprise, exactly right. Her father came in late September. Lord Edmund Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a carriage that had managed the northern roads with slightly less equanimity than its occupant, who descended at Ashgate House looking exactly as he always looked, unhurried, precise, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to announce himself, and embraced his daughter at the door with the undemonstrative warmth that was his particular gift. "You look different," he said, holding her at arm's length and examining her with the careful eye of someone who loves a person and therefore pays attention. "I am different," she said. "Better?" "Yes," she said, substantially. He stayed a week. She showed him the school on the second day, walked him through the East Wing, the library, the schoolroom where 33 children were engaged in the highly contentious project of learning long division, which she had introduced that week and which had produced a range of emotional responses from serene mastery to something approaching existential distress. He sat at the back of the room and watched without speaking for 40 minutes, with the stillness of a man who had raised a daughter alone for 7 years and knew what focused attention looked like when it was real and when it was performed. On the walk back to Ashgate that evening, he was quiet for a long time. "Mrs. Harwick told me," he said, "about the fire. I wrote to you about the fire. You wrote me a practical account," he said, "that answered the question of whether the school was intact and declined to address most of the questions I actually had." He glanced at her. "Mrs. Harwick was more comprehensive." "Martha is thorough in everything she does," Eliza said. She mentioned, her father said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has thought about how to say something and chosen his approach deliberately, that you went into the building. The books needed Eliza. I know, she said. I know, father, but the books were what the school was built on, and without them the school was a room and four walls and the work of 4 months undone. She looked at the path ahead. I would do it again. He was quiet for another moment. I know you would, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite reprimand and not quite pride. Something in between that was the specific emotional territory of a parent watching their child become the person they always believed they were. Lucas Hawthorne, he said then. Yes, she said. He pulled you out of the window. He did. Before or after you had finished moving the books? After, she said. He's not unreasonable. Her father made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I'd like to meet him. I expected you would, she said. I've arranged dinner at Blackmore for Thursday. Of course you have, he said. The dinner was not, in the social sense, a formal event. Lucas had made clear, in the way he made most things clear briefly and without apology, that he did not intend to perform his estate for Lord Whitmore's assessment, and that if Lord Whitmore wished to assess him, the most efficient method was a direct conversation. Eliza had relayed this to her father, who had said, "Good," with a finality that she recognized as genuine approval of the approach. They ate in the smaller dining room, which had been opened for the occasion, and bore the evidence of Mrs. Donnelly's thorough opinion about what constituted an appropriate table. 4 people: Eliza, her father, Lucas, and Martha Harwick, whose presence Eliza had specifically requested because Martha's was the most accurate account of Ravenshire that anyone would receive, and because she trusted Martha's judgment more than almost anyone else's. The conversation ranged. Eliza had expected it to be careful, the performed politeness of people establishing a basis for trust, and it was not careful at all. Her father asked Lucas direct questions about the estate's management and received direct answers. Lucas asked her father about the agricultural conditions of his own northern properties in a way that made clear he had considered them as a practical neighbor, rather than simply as the background to a woman he was interested in, which her father noted and filed away with the precision he brought to most things. Martha said, approximately 40 minutes into the meal, I want to say something that isn't my place to say. Everyone looked at her. My place, Martha continued, without particular discomfort, is the village of Ravenshire, and within that village the school that Lady Whitmore built. What I'm about to say concerns the school, which is why I'm claiming it as my place. She set down her fork. In 9 months, that school has gone from a borrowed room that smelled of ale to a library of 300 books and 33 enrolled children who can read better than most of their parents. It has survived a fire, the active opposition of the most influential farmer in the county, and the social implications of a London woman running an institution on the estate of an unmarried duke. She looked at Lord Whitmore directly. Your daughter is the reason this exists, not the idea of it, the daily, practical, unglamorous reality of it. I thought you should hear that from someone who watched it happen. Lord Edmund Whitmore looked at Martha Harwick for a moment, and then at his daughter, and then at Lucas Hawthorne. Whatever calculation he completed in that sequence of glances arrived at a visible conclusion. Thank you, Mrs. Harwick, he said. I had already arrived at that understanding, but I'm very glad to have it confirmed. After dinner, her father and Lucas sat by the fire in the study for an hour. Eliza and Martha washed up in the kitchen with Mrs. Donnelly, who was the kind of woman who found washing up after a good dinner a satisfying conclusion to an evening rather than an imposition, and who provided a running commentary on everything she had observed that evening that was both more perceptive and more entertaining than Eliza could have produced herself. When the men came out of the study, both of them had the specific quality of people who have concluded an important matter to mutual satisfaction and are not going to discuss the specifics of it, which Eliza respected without finding it as opaque as they perhaps imagined. Her father kissed her forehead at the door. He's a good man, he said quietly. I know, she said. Better than the last one. Considerably, she said. Good night, Eliza. October brought the question she had been both expecting and not quite ready for. Lucas asked it on a Thursday evening in the library, which was where the most important things between them had always happened. She had noticed this pattern without remarking on it, had come to think of the library as the room where honesty lived, where the books on the shelves constituted some kind of standing permission to say things plainly. He had been reading. She had been writing the term report, a detailed accounting of each student's progress that she prepared monthly and which had become, over the term, not just a professional record, but something closer to a portrait, each child rendered in the specific language of what they had learned and how and where the learning had surprised both of them. He set his book down. She finished the sentence she was writing and looked up. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before I ask you what I want to ask you." She put down her pen. 4 years ago, he said, I was engaged to be married. He said it with the directness he used for things that cost him. Not looking away, not hedging, giving her the full weight of it. Her name was Charlotte Vane. We had been engaged for 8 months. She was... He paused, considering the right word with the precision she recognized. Kind, he said. Genuinely kind. But she was a London woman, and I was already becoming someone who wanted to be here rather than there. And the distance between those two things grew until it couldn't be bridged. A pause. I ended the engagement. That was entirely my decision and entirely my responsibility. She didn't deserve it, and she suffered for it, and I came north afterward because I had learned something about myself that I needed to sit with for a long time. What had you learned? She asked. That I was capable of failing someone who trusted me, he said. Not from cruelty. From a failure to understand early enough that what I was moving toward required me to be honest about the cost of it to someone else. He held her gaze. I came north, and I closed the estate, and I told myself I was protecting everyone, including myself, from a repetition of that failure. He looked at the bookshelves. What I was actually doing was avoiding the risk of it entirely, which is a different thing and considerably less honorable. The library was quiet around them. Outside, Ravenshire's October dark was thorough and cold and indifferent, and entirely itself. Why are you telling me this now? She asked, though she already knew. Because I'm about to ask you a question that changes everything, he said, and you deserve to ask it with the full picture of who I am, including the parts I'm not proud of. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Charlotte Vane, whose name she had not known until 60 seconds ago, a woman she would never meet, who had been hurt by this man's failure of courage and honesty, who had probably rebuilt her life in the way that women always rebuild lives from the wreckage of men's decisions. She thought about Adrian Caldwell and the 3-second look across the ballroom and the difference between that look and the face across from her now, which was open in a way that Adrian's had never been. Genuinely open, hiding nothing, giving her everything she needed to make a fully informed decision. You were 29, she said. Or thereabouts. 30, he said. And you came north and spent 4 years learning something that you couldn't have learned any other way. She looked at him. I'm not Charlotte Vane, and you are not the man who failed her. Or rather, you are, but you're also 4 years further from him and considerably more honest. She let a beat pass. Ask your question. He looked at her steadily, and in his face she saw everything she had catalogued over 9 months. The man who carried boxes without ceremony, who stayed late in the study while she worked, who moved the open day forward because the arithmetic wasn't difficult, who pulled her through a window with complete lack of ceremony and looked at her afterward with an intensity that bypassed all his careful management of expression. Marry me, he said. Not as a performance, as a statement of the plainest possible intention, delivered by a man who had learned the cost of imprecision and was not paying it again. She did not answer immediately, not because she was uncertain. She was not uncertain, had not been uncertain since sometime in the library on the day the books went back on the shelves, but because the answer deserved a moment of the same deliberate honesty he had given to the question. Yes, she said, plainly and without reservation and with full understanding of who you are. He reached across the table and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with the ornamental romantic gesture that the ballrooms of London had taught her to associate with declarations of this kind. simply his hand around hers, warm and real and specific, with the quality of something that had been building toward this point for 9 months and had arrived without fanfare, because it was not the kind of thing that required fanfare to be real. Thomas Harwick's forgotten copybook was on the corner of the table between them. The lamp burned low. The northern night settled around Blackmore with the comprehensive thoroughness it brought to everything. "We should tell Mrs. Donnelly," Eliza said. "She'll know within the hour regardless, and she'll be considerably better disposed if she hears it directly." Lucas made a sound that was fully and completely a laugh. She had heard it before, but rarely, and it was always slightly startling because it transformed his face in the specific way that unexpected warmth transforms a landscape you thought you knew. "Yes," he said. "We should." The news moved through Ravenshire at the speed that all significant news traveled in Ravenshire, which was to say, by the following morning, everyone knew. Martha Harwick arrived at the East Wing schoolroom before the children, which was unprecedented, and looked at Eliza with an expression that was doing several things at once. "Well," she said. "Well," Eliza agreed. "He's a good man," Martha said. "I said so at the beginning. I said his word was reliable. You also said you trusted less easily that you understood why he said it." "I understand it now," Martha said. "Some things require time to be legible." She paused. "Are you happy?" Eliza considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about the word happy and whether it was adequate to what she felt, whether it captured the specific quality of standing in a place you had built, with work that was real and a man who was honest and a future that was yours rather than assigned to you, in a northern landscape that demanded nothing but your full presence and rewarded it accordingly. "Yes," she said. "Thoroughly." Martha nodded. "Good," she said. And that was the end of it, because Martha Harwick was not a woman who over-explained things that were sufficiently explained. The letter from London came 3 weeks later. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Not Adrian's this time, but her cousin Margaret's, which was sharper and more angular, and had always looked like Margaret herself, precise, efficient, impossible to misread. She opened it over breakfast at Ashgate and read it with the morning light coming through the eastern windows. Margaret had heard the news. Margaret had heard it, in fact, from her husband's cousin in Newcastle, who had heard it from a merchant with business interests in Ravenshire, which was the specific, improbable chain by which information traveled between the wild north and London society, and demonstrated that the distance between them was considerably less absolute than it felt from either end. The letter was, characteristically, brief. Margaret did not use 7 words when 4 would serve, but the 4 words that mattered were toward the end of the second paragraph. "I am very glad." And then, in Margaret's handwriting, which she had never seen used for anything other than precision and efficiency, "You chose correctly, both times." Eliza read this sentence twice. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her writing desk, not the locked drawer, the regular one, the one for things that mattered but weren't painful. And she sat for a moment with the morning light and the sound of the hills and the distant movement of Ravenshire going about its October morning. Both times. The choice to leave London, and the choice she had made before the fire on the drive, and the answer she had given in the library. Margaret, who saw things clearly and said them plainly, had understood both choices and found them correct, and her understanding constituted, Eliza thought, the only form of London's opinion she had ever actually wanted. The wedding was set for November, not in London. That was the first and most easily agreed upon point. Not a society event, not a formal ceremony designed for the display of rank and connection and the satisfaction of people whose primary interest was in the spectacle rather than the substance. There had been, she knew, some expectation among the more connected families of the northern county that the Duke of Blackmore's marriage would be the kind of occasion that required extensive preparation and a guest list that reflected the full weight of both families' positions. Lucas had declined this expectation with characteristic efficiency. "The people I want there," he had said to her, "are the people who are already here." And she had agreed completely, because the people already there were the people who had carried books through a window in a fire, who had come back the next morning to put them on the shelves, whose children sat in the schoolroom every morning and did long division with varying degrees of success, and read their way through the library with the steady, accumulating appetite of people discovering that the world inside books was not a luxury, but a necessity. The ceremony took place on a Saturday in the second week of November, in the courtyard at Blackmore, which had been the site of the fire and the bucket chain and the books in the grass, and which was now, in the early November cold, hung with lanterns that Mrs. Donnelly and Hannah Collier and approximately 14 other women had organized with a thoroughness that went well beyond what had been requested and produced something genuinely beautiful. The warm light against the dark stone, the copper beeches losing their last leaves above, the northern sky clear and cold and absolutely indifferent to the occasion in the way that was, she had come to understand its highest form of approval. She wore not midnight blue, but deep green, a color she had chosen herself without strategic calculation, because it was the color of the hills in summer when the heather hadn't come in yet and the fields were at their fullest, and because it was hers, not performed for anyone else's assessment. Her father stood beside her. He had the specific expression of a man who had done one thing right that he was certain of, which was raising a daughter who knew her own mind and was watching the evidence of it with the quiet, complete satisfaction of someone settling a long-held account. The village was there, all of it, as far as she could tell. The families she had taught, and the families she was still working to reach. The tenant farmers from the estate, including John Collier with Hannah on his arm, and their children scrubbed to a standard that suggested Hannah's opinion of what constituted appropriate wedding turnout was both strong and specific. Martha Harwick stood in the front with Thomas Harwick beside her, Thomas wearing his good coat and holding himself with the gravity of someone who understood the occasion, even if he couldn't have fully explained why it mattered beyond the immediate and obvious. Robert Greer was there. He stood at the back, hat in hand, beside his boys, James with his book tucked under one arm, because apparently James carried books the way other people carried hats, as a natural extension of being dressed. And when Eliza's eyes passed over him, he looked at her with an expression that was not warm, because warmth was not in his repertoire, but was honest, which she had come to believe was worth more. Adrian Caldwell was there. She had not invited him. He had written, 3 weeks before the wedding, in the same direct style that his last letter to Ravenshire had used, the one she had actually finished reading, and had asked plainly whether he might attend. Not to disrupt, not to appeal, not with any purpose beyond, "I would like to see it." She had written back after a day of consideration that he was welcome if he wished to come. He stood near the back of the courtyard, on the far side from Greer, and when she entered the courtyard on her father's arm and the lanterns caught the green of her dress, and the people she loved were all around her in the cold November air, she found him for a moment in the crowd. He was watching with an expression that was not what she had feared, not bitterness, not the legible suffering of a man performing regret, but something quieter and more real than that. The expression of a man watching something he had been too small for and understanding, with complete clarity and no remaining illusion, exactly how and why he had been too small for it. He had written to her father, she had learned from Lord Whitmore in October. A formal letter acknowledging what he had done in London and requesting, not seeking, not demanding, simply requesting that Lord Whitmore know it had not been forgotten or minimized by the man responsible for it. Her father had shown her the letter. She had read it once and returned it to him and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say, and because the letter was between the two men and not hers to comment on. She did not hold what he had done easily. She doubted she ever would. But she had spent 9 months building something in the specific direction away from the ballroom in London, and the building had required everything she had, and what she found when she looked back at that night from the vantage of this November courtyard, with the lanterns warm against the cold stone and the north wind moving through the copper beeches, was that the hurt had been real, but had not been the end of anything. It had been in the specific, irreducible way of things that break us towards something truer, the beginning. She looked away from Adrian and turned to Lucas. Lucas Hawthorne, Duke of Blackmore, stood at the center of his own courtyard in his good coat that was not his finest coat because he was not a man who performed himself, and he looked at her crossing the courtyard toward him with an expression that did not manage itself at all, that was simply, completely, all the things he was underneath the careful walls he had spent 4 years building, offered to her without reservation or decoration in the clear light of a November morning in front of everyone who mattered. She reached him. Her father placed her hand in his. The warmth of his hand around hers was the same warmth as the library table, specific and real, and carrying 9 months of accumulated evidence that it was permanent. They said their words. She heard them as she said them with the full, deliberate weight of someone who had learned the cost of words that didn't mean what they appeared to and was not paying that cost again. She heard them in his voice as he said them, direct, unhurried, with the quality of a man who had spent 4 years learning the difference between a decision and a choice, and had chosen. When it was done, the courtyard filled with the particular noise of 30 people simultaneously releasing something they had been holding, and Thomas Harwick made a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a shout, and was entirely himself, and Hannah Collier cried without any apparent embarrassment about it. And Mrs. Donnelly said something to Martha Harwick that made Martha produce her rare, transformative smile. And Lord Edmund Whitmore put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the northern sky with the expression of a man who had done what he could, and found it, in the end, sufficient. Lucas looked at her in the noise of it all. She looked at him. "Well," he said, which was Ravenshire's word, loaded with everything it didn't need to explain. "Well," she said back. That winter, they built the permanent schoolhouse. It was not the old ruin on Becker Lane. That site was cleared and the stone repurposed for a dry stone wall on the north field that John Collier had been wanting for 2 years. The new building went up on the east side of the Blackmore Estate Drive, on a piece of land that Lucas had formally deeded to the Ravensshire School in a charter drawn up by Mr. Featherstone and registered with the county in October. 2 rooms, to start, a schoolroom and a library, with windows on the south side to let the best of the winter light in, and a fireplace in each room that was large enough to actually heat them, which was not the romantic detail it sounded like, but the entirely practical result of Eliza specifying the dimensions herself after 9 months of teaching in rooms with inadequate fires. She taught in it for the first time in February. She stood at the front of the new schoolroom on the first morning, with the smell of new plaster and fresh timber all around her and the winter light coming through the south windows exactly as she had planned, and 33 children finding their places with the efficiency of people who knew the routine because they had built it together, and she felt the completeness of it. Not the completion of something ending, but the specific completeness of something that has become what it was always trying to be. She thought, briefly, about the woman who had stood in a ballroom in London 13 months ago, holding untouched champagne, refusing to fall apart in front of people who would have been entertained by it. That woman had done the right thing. She had not fallen apart. She had held herself together with the fierce private stubbornness that was perhaps her most important quality, the one that London had tried to call a liability, and that had turned out, in the north, in the cold, in the work, to be the thing that held everything else up. She had come here broken in the specific way that public humiliation breaks people. Not the bones, not the deep self, but the surface. The constructed identity, the version of herself that had been built to fit inside a life that turned out to have no room for the real thing. The breaking had been necessary. She hadn't chosen it, but she had used it, had taken the wreckage of the life she'd planned, and built something from it that was more real and more hers than anything the original plan would have produced. Outside the new schoolroom window, Ravensshire was doing what Ravensshire did in February, gray and cold and entirely indifferent, the hills visible through thin cloud, the heather brown and stubborn, the estate drive empty at this early hour, except for the distant figure of a man walking the Northfield boundary in the specific systematic way that meant he was thinking about drainage. She watched him for a moment. He didn't know she was watching. He walked the boundary with his hands behind his back and his head slightly down, and the complete physical ease of a man who has found the place in the world where his body makes sense, and she thought about the reasons they'll admit to and the reasons they won't, and about all the reasons he had finally admitted to, laid out plainly in a library by lamplight without evasion or management or the performance of a self more convenient than the real one. Thomas Harwick appeared at her elbow. He was 10 now, which had happened in the way things happen when you're paying close attention to everything else, without announcement, as a simple fact. He was the best reader in the school by some distance and had recently developed strong opinions about the arrangement of the nature section that she intended to take seriously. "There's a new book on the library shelf," he said. "The blue one. I don't know what section it goes in." "Show me," she said. She followed him to the library door. The new library was smaller than the one at Blackmore, but organized with the same logic, the same colored sections, the same printed cards in large, clear letters. She had carried the system here from the East Wing, had taught the older children to maintain it, had made the catalog a living document that anyone could add to when new books arrived. The blue book was on the table by the door, which was where she put new acquisitions before cataloging them. She looked at the spine. On the Education of Women, 1849, by a name she didn't recognize, a recent publication, she thought, and looked inside the cover and found in Lucas's handwriting, "For the Ravenshire School Library." L.H. She stood with the book in her hands for a moment. She looked at the shelves. She looked at Thomas, waiting with the patient expectancy of a child who has learned that Miss Whitmore always answers questions eventually, and it's worth waiting for. "History section," she said, "between Mill and Wollstonecraft." She handed it to him. He took it with both hands, turned to the shelf, found the position, placed the book with the focused correctness of a boy who had been taught that things have proper places, and considered it his personal responsibility to know them. Then he stepped back and looked at the shelf with his hands on his hips, a gesture so precisely adult and unconscious that it made her throat tighten briefly, because it was the gesture of someone who had been watching competent people work for a year and had absorbed their posture along with their knowledge. "There," he said, satisfied, certain. "There," she thought. She looked at the shelf, at the new book between its neighbors, at the library that had been rebuilt from a fire and was now its own building, its own permanent declaration in stone and timber, and the carefully maintained catalog of everything it held. She thought about what she would say, someday, to a young woman who found herself standing in a ballroom with untouched champagne, watching the man she had trusted choose something else in front of everyone. She thought about what she would say that was true and specific rather than comfortable and general. "Go north," she thought. "Find the thing that needs doing. Do it every day without glamour and without guarantee. Build something that exists beyond your reputation, beyond anyone's opinion of you, beyond the story they tried to make you live inside. Build it from what's actually here, the real ground, the real work, the real people who show up when the fire starts. And when you find the person who carries boxes without ceremony and lights a lamp beside you in the dark and tells you the hard thing about himself before he asks you the important question, hold that. That's not a small thing. That is, in the accounting that actually matters, everything." Outside the library window, the figure in the north field had turned and was walking back toward the house. She watched him come. That particular walk, unhurried and certain, with the quality of a man who knew where he was going because he had decided to go there and did not second-guess decisions that had been made in good faith with full information. He looked up, found the window, found her. He raised a hand, not a wave, really, just an acknowledgement, a recognition. The Ravenshire gesture, stripped of ornament, carrying the full weight of what it didn't need to say. She raised hers in return. Behind her, 33 children were reading. The books were on the shelves. The north wind moved over Ravenshire with its characteristic complete indifference, and the hills held the winter light with their characteristic refusal to release anything before they were absolutely done. And in the permanent schoolhouse on the east side of the Blackmore Drive, built from stone on ground that had been formally given and would not be taken back, something that had begun in the wreckage of a London ballroom had become, in all the ways that mattered and would continue to matter long after the people who built it were gone, simply and entirely real. Eliza Whitmore. Eliza Hawthorne now, though she used both names and would not be argued out of either, turned back to her library. There was work to do. There was always work to do. She had never been happier in her life.